Hi guys. Tonight we step into a landscape coated in ice. A world where the only thing standing between you and frostbite is the fragile ingenuity of people who lived centuries before central heating. Imagine it's late January in medieval Europe. The fields lie silent, crusted white. The village roofs are capped with frost so thick you could scrape it off with a knife. Smoke dribbles lazily from crooked chimneys. But even inside those houses, the air is frigid, your breath visible in little puffs. You probably won't survive this night without some very clever tricks, and we're going to walk through them together. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you want, share your location and the local time where you are listening. Now, dim the lights, and let's wander into the frosty darkness. You trudge along a frozen path, your boots crunching on the brittle ground. The houses of wattle and daub are dark and huddled against one another, almost like villagers themselves pressing together for warmth. The thatched roofs glisten silver, icy dew frozen stiff. That frost isn't just decoration, it creeps indoors, settling on beams and rafters. Farmers often woke to find a delicate crust of ice on the inside of their shutters. You press your hand against the timber wall, and it's as if you've touched stone. Every nerve in your fingertips tells you this place is not designed for comfort, but simply for surviving. A mainstream historical truth. Winters in medieval Europe were harsh, and during the so-called Little Ice Age that began in the late Middle Ages, average temperatures dipped enough to cause repeated crop failures. People went hungry, and cold was not just inconvenient, it was dangerous. When you imagine a simple frost outside, remember it wasn't always picturesque. It could mean famine. As you step closer, you notice the smoke seeping from the chimney is thin, because wood is scarce. A blazing fire all night would be a dream, but firewood was rationed carefully. Too much used now, and you'd freeze later in February. The hearth embers are coaxed to last, but never strong enough to chase the chill from a large room. Here's a quirky little tidbit. Some peasants smeared ox blood or even mud mixed with straw onto the outside of their walls in winter, a primitive insulation strategy. The layers hardened like cement, slowing the entry of wind. Imagine sitting inside, with the faint iron smell of blood baked into your walls, believing it would hold the frost at bay. You walk into a one-room cottage. It's a shared life. Children, parents, maybe grandparents, and possibly a few chickens or a goat. Smoke lingers low, stinging your eyes. You notice frost clinging stubbornly to the rafters. The walls shiver with the wind pressing against them. In this place, sleep is not gentle luxury, it's a battle plan. Every family member plays their part. Scholars still debate whether winters were consistently harsher than today, or whether we simply romanticize the suffering. Some argue people were already adapted to a different baseline, hardened by constant exposure. Others suggest sudden shifts in climate made those nights feel catastrophic. But no matter where the academic arguments fall, the reality of frost on the thatch and frost inside your chamber pot is something you can almost feel against your skin right now. You curl onto a straw mattress in your imagination, the air crisp against your cheeks, your nose half numb, your breath puffing in the dark. Someone beside you pulls a rough wool blanket over both of you, scratchy but essential. The sounds outside fade into the hiss of the wind and the occasional groan of the beams in the cold. And in that moment, you realize that the frost on the roof is more than scenery. It's the enemy, perched just above, waiting for you to fall still long enough to seep into your bones. You lie there, listening to the beams creak in protest, and realize something important. One body is never enough against the cold. In the medieval world, survival was not a solo sport. Entire families shared a single bed, pressed close on a straw-filled sack or rough pallet. This isn't the fairy tale canopy bed you might imagine from tapestries. It's often just a bag of reeds stitched with coarse linen, lumpy and smelling faintly of mildew. Yet when 6 or 7 bodies climb on, the mattress comes alive with heat. The mainstream historical fact here is plain. The medieval bed was communal. In England, France, and across much of Europe, it was completely normal for parents, children, and sometimes servants to share sleeping quarters. A visitor might even be invited to crawl in too, the act seen less as intimacy and more as necessity. You tuck yourself between two siblings in this imagined bed, feeling elbows and knees collide, someone's cold feet brushing yours. At first it's chaotic, but then the heat builds. The human body is a furnace producing constant warmth, and the more people you press together, the warmer it gets. You suddenly understand why beds were big not for luxury, but for survival. Here's a quirky tidbit. Records show that even innkeepers often put strangers into the same bed. Imagine walking into a roadside tavern, tired and frozen from the road, and being directed to squeeze in beside a farmer, his wife, and maybe a traveling peddler who reeks of salted fish. To us, awkward. To them, practical. Historians still puzzle over how much privacy people expected in these sleeping arrangements. Some argue that medieval folk were less sensitive to touch and exposure, simply because their daily life was so crowded. Others insist that awkwardness did exist but was outweighed by sheer necessity. What you can be sure of is that shivering alone was far riskier than tolerating a stranger's snores. The smell inside such a bed is hard to ignore. Wool never truly dries, straw grows damp, and sweat from bodies mingles in the blankets. You breathe it in, half choking, but you also notice your nose begins to thaw. Would you trade warmth for sweet air? Most did, and without hesitation. Children, small and vulnerable, were often placed at the center of the huddle, swaddled in the middle like tiny embers of heat. Parents and older siblings formed a living shield around them. You can picture a father's arm stretched protectively over the youngest, even as he himself shivered at the edge where the cold seeped in. As you drift in this scene, the whisper of breathing around you becomes hypnotic. Snores, sighs, the rustle of straw, all form a kind of medieval white noise. It is the sound of survival, of a family becoming one breathing beast against the frost. The storm outside rattles the shutters, but inside, your shared warmth pushes back against the night. You shift on the scratchy straw sack, aware of every movement from the bodies pressed against you. It's warm, yes, but also uncomfortable. That's when you notice the divide between rich and poor most clearly. For peasants, the bed is a communal pile of straw and cloth. For nobles and prosperous townsfolk, however, the feather bed reigns supreme. And in winter, that difference could mean the line between miserable survival and something approaching comfort. A mainstream historical fact stands firm here. Down-filled mattresses and quilts were a mark of privilege across medieval Europe. Goose down was harvested painstakingly, plucked from live birds or collected after molting, and then stitched into layered sacks. When you lie on such a bed, it puffs beneath you, lifting you off the frozen floor and wrapping you in a cocoon of softness. Not only does it cushion your bones, it traps heat far more effectively than straw. You climb, in imagination, into one of these elite beds. The wooden frame creaks under its ornate posts, carved with symbols of the family's lineage. A canopy above isn't just decorative, it keeps warmth from escaping. You sink into the feather bed and immediately feel the difference. Instead of lumps of damp straw, the mattress cradles you evenly, like sleeping on a warm cloud. For a medieval person who might have never known true comfort, this would feel like a miracle. Now for a quirky tidbit. Some noble households were so proud of their feather beds that they included them in wills. Mothers bequeathed my best feather mattress and coverlet to daughters upon marriage, treating them like treasures. And they were treasures. A feather bed could take years to make and cost more than a farmhand's annual wages. You picture a dowry chest, not full of gold, but stuffed with quilts because in a cold world, warmth was wealth. The contrast is sharp when you think back to the peasant's cottage. Straw mattresses had to be refreshed often, usually with rushes gathered from riverbanks. In winter, that straw might be half-rotted, damp, and filled with bugs. The smell clings to you, earthy and sour. Imagine lying down on that after a day's work and knowing you'll itch all night. Then imagine walking into a manor house and being offered a guest bed layered with goose down and fur throws. The gulf between classes has rarely felt so literal, pressing into your skin as you sleep. Scholars still debate how common featherbeds actually were. Some argue that only the wealthiest elites, royalty, and major landowners had them, while others point to surviving wills and inventories suggesting that prosperous townsfolk and merchants managed to afford at least one feather mattress in the household. What's clear is that their presence signaled status, just as much as silverware or embroidered clothing. To invite a guest into your featherbed was to display not only hospitality, but rank. But don't mistake nobility's nights for perfect comfort. Their castles were draughty stone caverns, with icy winds sliding through arrow slits disguised as windows. A featherbed helps, yes, but without fires burning in every chamber, the cold bit deeply. Even kings slept wearing layers of wool and sometimes lined caps. The difference was relative, comfort compared to straw, but never compared to our heated homes today. Let yourself imagine the sensory details. The featherbed sighs when you roll onto it, releasing a faint smell of goose down, dusty but warm. The quilt above you, sewn with elaborate embroidery, feels heavy in your hands, weighing down against restless tossing. Candles gutter in their holders, casting golden warmth that flickers across tapestries hung on the walls to block drafts. You hear faint crackling from a brazier in the corner, filling the chamber with a soft glow. This is luxury by medieval standards. And yet, despite all these advantages, you still see your breath in the cold air. Meanwhile, downstairs in the servants' quarters, straw mattresses are lined side by side, pressed onto wooden boards. Servants huddle together just like peasants, clothed in patched wool, with only a thin blanket to cover them. The smell of smoke and sweat fills the room, stronger here because chimneys don't reach down this far. You realize that within the same household, two worlds coexist, one cushioned in feathers, the other scratchy and raw. Consider the social meaning of this. A featherbed wasn't just bedding, it was a statement of survival, comfort, and hierarchy. Guests who experienced it firsthand would leave knowing they'd been treated well. Wills ensured they were passed down, because warmth could define your future as much as land or livestock. Cold nights were democratic, but bedding made them aristocratic. Another unusual note: sometimes, in cities, wealthier households rented featherbeds to travelers. Imagine checking into a medieval lodging house and being told you could pay extra to sleep in genuine goose down. It's a reminder that warmth was a commodity, a business transaction, even centuries before heated hotels. And yet, despite this opulence, some nobles complained. Surviving letters and household manuals mention featherbeds being too soft, causing aches. Others worried they bred vermin more easily than straw because the dense stuffing's difficult to air out. A fine luxury, yes, but not without its flaws. You picture a noblewoman fanning herself in frustration at itching bites, while a servant mutters that perhaps straw was more practical after all. The featherbed becomes almost symbolic in your mind. It's not just a place to rest, it's the embodiment of medieval inequality. You close your eyes and feel the difference between lying pressed among family and animals on damp straw and sinking alone into a feather-stuffed quilt beneath embroidered drapes. Two experiences, separated by walls and wealth, yet both haunted by the same winter chill creeping in from outside. And so, as the frost thickens on the windows and the hearth dwindles to embers, you realize something almost ironic. Whether you lie on straw or feathers, medieval cold never truly spares you. At best, you buy a little softness, a little insulation, and the comfort of knowing you've paid for warmth when others cannot. But the breath rising before your eyes still reminds you you're only a few thin layers away from the frost that never sleeps. The featherbed lingers in your imagination, plush and lofty, but the truth is most medieval families never touched goose down in their lives. Instead, they turned to the most available, reliable source of heat they could find: living, breathing animals. You picture it: the creak of the wooden door at dusk, a farmer shuffling in, pulling behind him a reluctant goat, a couple of hens scuttle at his heels. And in the corner of the room, curled tight on the rush-strewn floor. A dog thumps its tail half-heartedly, already part of the nightly ritual. Here's the mainstream historical fact. Animals were often brought indoors during the winter, not merely for protection against thieves or predators, but because their body heat made a measurable difference in a room that otherwise hovered just above freezing. In simple cottages without fireplaces in every chamber, the warmth of a cow or pig was more valuable than any tapestry. You shuffle closer in imagination, sitting cross-legged by the hearth while the family settles in. A pig sighs loudly, folding itself down with surprising gentleness, its bristly hide radiating warmth into the chill air. Chickens flutter to roost on the rafters, leaving behind their faint, dusty smell. A scruffy dog curls beside the bed, pressing against your leg with a deliberate claim, "I belong here, and I'm warmer than you." The heat from this accidental menagerie builds until the frost on the inside of the shutters begins to melt slightly at the edges. Now for a quirky tidbit. Medieval sources occasionally joke about bed dogs, referring not to pets as companions but to the literal function of a dog in bed to keep your feet from freezing off. Wealthy households even bred small lapdogs partly for this purpose. Think of them as living hot water bottles with fur. Imagine tucking one under the blanket at night, its little body shivering for you while you mutter thanks into the dark. Of course, scholars still discuss just how common this practice was. Did peasants universally sleep with livestock inside their cottages? Or was it more seasonal, only during the bitterest cold? Some argue that many animals stayed in attached byres or stables, separated by a thin wall, their heat still bleeding into the living space. Others claim goats and pigs often wandered freely into the room, especially at night, when warmth outweighed neatness. Archaeological finds of compact floor plans lend weight to both views, whether across the wall or under the same rafters. Animals were effectively roommates in the medieval night. But companionship had its costs. You wrinkle your nose at the smell. Goats leave their pungent musk, chickens shed feathers, and pigs grunt restlessly. The straw matting underfoot is littered with droppings, swept hastily in the morning but never fully gone. You imagine the soundscape too. The intermittent cluck of a hen, the soft snore of a cow, the occasional bark cutting through the dark. Sleep here is not silent or fragrant, but it is warm. Still, warmth was prized so highly that discomfort became tolerable. Better to doze to the rhythm of animal noises than to wake frozen stiff. In fact, the psychological comfort of hearing a dog's breathing or a cow shifting its weight might even have been soothing, a kind of medieval white noise. You begin to understand why lullabies and stories sometimes mention animals as guardians of the hearth. For a noble household, the arrangement looked different. Animals didn't share the main chambers, but prized lapdogs still found their way beneath quilts, and cats earned a permanent place near the hearth for their rodent-catching services. A noblewoman writing to her daughter in the 15th century even advised, "Keep the small hound in thy bed for thy comfort," a piece of advice that straddles practicality and affection. Picture a chamber with tapestries fluttering in the draught, the mistress of the house tucking a fluffy spaniel beneath her fur coverlet, while servants bank the fire. Even in luxury, animal heat found its place. The sensory experience deepens as you lean into it. The cottage is dim, smoky from the hearth, and alive with smells: wool, straw, feathers, dung, and the faint tang of wood ash. You tuck your feet closer to the dog, feeling its body quiver in sleep. Your hand rests on coarse fur, rough but reassuring. Outside, the wind rattles the shutters, but inside, the combined breathing of human and beast keeps the cold from creeping too far. There's also a social dimension here. Sharing space with animals blurred the lines between human and beast in everyday life. Modern notions of hygiene simply didn't exist. Families thought less about filth and more about survival. Children grew up accustomed to sharing their blankets with a dog or waking to a rooster crowing indoors. Imagine the sense of normalcy. What would strike you as chaotic and unhygienic was, to them, simply winter. Occasionally, religious writers complained about this closeness. Some monks grumbled that peasants lived no better than swine, their cottages filled with beasts. But those monks, warm in their communal dormitories, may have overlooked the quiet wisdom of the arrangement. Warmth first, dignity later. The image lingers, a family bundled together, the dogs sprawled across their feet, a pig near the door, chickens above, and frost outside losing its grip. It's messy, noisy, and pungent, but it works. And that, more than anything, explains how medieval people made it through the darkest nights without freezing to death. You are half asleep, curled against the warmth of the dog at your feet, when someone in the family tugs a heavy covering across the bodies piled together. The fabric is coarse, rough against your chin, but heavy enough to press you deeper into the straw. You shift slightly, brushing your hand across the surface, and realize it isn't woven wool at all. It's fur thick, musky, and undeniably warm. Here is the mainstream historical fact. Before quilts and duvets became common in Europe, many families relied on animal furs as their primary form of bedding. Wolf hides, sheepskins, even bear pelts were laid over sleepers. Furs trapped air in their dense layers, offering insulation far superior to woven cloth. For medieval households, especially in the north, they were more than a luxury, they were survival tools. Imagine the sensation of pulling a sheepskin over your shoulders. The lanolin in the wool leaves a faint, oily residue on your fingers, the smell rich and earthy. When you bury your face in it, you inhale the lingering scent of the animal itself, something between comfort and reminder of the hunt. The weight is heavy, grounding, as if the pelt pins you against the bed, refusing to let the cold sneak underneath. Now, a quirky tidbit. In some households, pelts weren't just laid across beds, they were hung on walls to serve double duty. A wolf's hide nailed behind your head both trapped heat and warded off drafts. The sight of its snarling face, teeth bared even in death, might also act as a kind of medieval nightlight, a talisman against evil spirits. Children drifting to sleep under its watchful eyes probably felt both reassured and faintly terrified. Scholars still debate how accessible such furs were to ordinary peasants. Were bearskins truly common in cottages, or were they prized possessions of hunters and lords? Some argue that poorer households relied mostly on sheepskins, plentiful and practical, while nobles flaunted exotic pelts imported from the north, such as sable or ermine. Inventories of noble estates list extravagant collections of these furs, suggesting that warmth was also a statement of prestige. Meanwhile, peasants had to make do with whatever their flocks provided. Still, even humble sheepskins made a difference. Picture a mother tucking her children beneath several patched-together fleeces, the wool rough but cozy. The smell of lanolin fills the small room, masking the sour odor of damp straw. Outside, the wind screeches like an unquiet spirit, but under those hides the children sweat lightly, cheeks flushed against the bitter night. For the wealthy, the practice grew into spectacle. In castles and manor houses, beds might be layered with multiple furs, fox, ermine, lynx, each chosen not only for warmth but for status. Ermine in particular, with its pristine white winter coat, became associated with purity and nobility. A noblewoman reclining beneath ermine was not simply warm, she was declaring her rank to any who entered the chamber. You can almost hear the rustle of servants arranging pelts with careful hands, ensuring each piece displayed its finery. But even luxury had limits. Castles were notorious for their drafts. Imagine sleeping beneath 3 layers of fur in a vast stone hall, only to wake with your breath clouding above your face. The pelts kept your body warm, but your nose remained icy, your hands numb if they strayed from under the covers. That contrast between smothering heat beneath the blankets and the frozen air beyond was one of the defining sensations of medieval winter sleep. Here's another quirky twist. Pelts were sometimes used as portable bedding. Travelers might carry rolled sheepskins to unroll on a floor or bench at night. In a world without central heating, your blanket was your bed, your survival kit, and sometimes even your status symbol. A passing merchant showing off a glossy fox skin wasn't just bragging about a trade, he was showing off a reliable way to avoid frostbite. There's a tactile memory in all of this. You can feel the coarseness of sheep's wool scratching at your wrists, the silky softness of fox brushing your cheek, the weight of bear pressing you down into the straw. You hear the muffled rustle when someone shifts, the sound of pelts rubbing against one another. You smell the lingering musk, sometimes pleasant, sometimes sour. This sensory world of furs is a reminder that medieval sleep was not sterile comfort, it was raw, earthy, visceral. Of course, with furs came certain risks. Vermin loved to burrow into the thick layers. Lice and fleas made homes in pelts, thriving in the warmth just as humans did. To air them out, families hung skins over fires or draped them across fences in weak winter sun. You picture women beating the hides with sticks to chase out insects, while children watched the dust rise like smoke. Even with effort, infestations remained common. You traded one discomfort cold for another itch. Still, when the frost clawed at the shutters and ice rimed the inside of your windows, that trade felt worthwhile. The weight of a fur was a kind of reassurance. No matter how bitter the night, you were wrapped in the echo of an animal's survival. That sense of continuity, life-giving warmth after death, might have carried psychological comfort too. You reflect on the symbolism. In many cultures, wearing or sleeping under the hide of a beast was seen as inheriting its strength. A child tucked beneath a wolf pelt might be thought braver, protected by the spirit of the predator. A warrior sleeping under bear fur might believe some fragment of the animal's power lingered in the hide. Whether or not that belief warmed the body, it surely warmed the mind. The fire in the hearth crackles low. You pull the fur tighter around yourself, its heft pressing you into the mattress. The straw pricks your side, but the warmth is undeniable. Outside, frost creeps silently across the thatch, indifferent to your survival. Yet beneath your rough blanket of hides, you almost feel smug you've stolen warmth from the wild, and tonight at least, the cold will not win. You lie there beneath the rough weight of pelts, the smoky tang of the hearth lingering in your nose, when you notice something else. Nobody is stripping down to bare skin. In this age, warmth is not about nightgowns or loose pajamas. It is about never removing your day's armor against the cold. Clothing becomes bedding, bedding becomes clothing, and the two blur until you hardly know where one ends and the other begins. Contemporary accounts remind us that medieval people often slept fully dressed, or at least in several layers of linen and wool. The layers held precious heat in, and stripping them off was a luxury few could afford during January's bite. Some chronicles even describe travelers falling asleep in boots, hats, and cloaks, unwilling to expose a single inch of flesh to icy air. To our modern sense of bedtime ritual, this seems unimaginable, but to them it was simply practical. You imagine yourself crawling into a lumpy straw mattress, still wearing your woolen tunic, hose pulled up, and perhaps a cloak draped around your shoulders. The cloth is scratchy, seams dig into your side, but the alternative bare skin against freezing air is unthinkable. Even nobles with feather beds wore underlayers to keep their bodies insulated. They would have traded satin nightgowns for woolen shifts once the cold settled in. One curious practice recorded in household guides was to sleep with belts still tied, even knives at the waist, because removing them would mean exposing skin to chill. Imagine rolling over in bed, hearing the clink of a buckle, feeling the sharp edge of a blade digging into your thigh. It wasn't comfort, they didn't expect comfort, it was survival. There remains lively debate among researchers about just how far this layering went. Some argue that peasants rarely undressed at all in winter, wearing the same tunics day and night until spring thaw. Others suggest that undergarments were swapped out occasionally, at least for hygiene. The truth likely varied by region and by poverty level. But the common thread is clear. Your medieval knight was never naked. The smell is hard to ignore. Wool that has absorbed days of sweat, smoke and rain doesn't exactly whisper, fresh. Crawling under the covers fully clothed meant bringing every odor of the day into the shared bed. Imagine 6 bodies, each wrapped in unwashed tunics, pressed close together. The musk is pungent, layered with smoke from the fire and the faint animal tang of pelts. You wrinkle your nose, but you also realize how quickly the smell becomes background once the chill leaves your bones. For the wealthy, sleeping clothed carried an added element of modesty. Guest beds were often shared with strangers, so remaining in layers preserved some sense of decorum. A visiting merchant might climb into a noble's guest bed and lie stiffly beside him, both men clad in tunics, avoiding awkwardness that bare skin would surely magnify. It was warmth, but it was also social etiquette. Here's another oddity. Some people sewed themselves into their winter garments, stitching the seams closed with rough thread, essentially turning their clothing into a second skin for months. They cut themselves free in spring. Imagine the mixture of relief and disgust at finally shedding those layers, skin pale beneath, fabric stiff with grime. That was the cost of warmth. You can almost hear the sound of wool brushing against wool as bodies shift in the dark, the scrape of coarse fabric against skin, the rustle of cloaks layered one over the other. Fingers remain gloved, toes remain encased in rough stockings, heads wrapped in linen caps. The only parts exposed are noses and cheeks, often reddened with cold. Even then, people might drape an extra scrap of cloth across their faces to keep frostbite at bay. In noble households, bedclothes sometimes became extravagant, layered with silks or lined with fur. But underneath, the principle remained the same. Keep the wool on. An embroidered gown might hide the practicality of thermal underlayers, but warmth always came first. You picture a lady of the manor pulling a silk coverlet over herself, beneath which she still wears 2 linen shifts, wool stockings, and a fur-lined cap. The beauty is a mask. The reality is insulation. The psychological side of it mattered too. Going to bed dressed blurred the line between day and night. Sleep was less about relaxation and more about endurance. You never shed the day's sweat. You never escaped the smoke clinging to your hair. In a sense, winter in the Middle Ages was one long, continuous act of survival, where even rest was a battle fought under wool and linen. And yet, there was comfort to be found. Layers gave a sense of security. Children swaddled in too many garments slept deeply, their little limbs stiff within wrappings. Adults huddled together, boots still on, and found the reassurance of heat pooling between them. It wasn't softness that lulled them. It was the knowledge they had made it through another day without freezing. By now, you can feel the weight of your own tunic pressing on your chest as you imagine this scene. You roll slightly, fabric rasping against the pelt above you, boots nudging against someone else's shins. It's crowded, uncomfortable, and far from fresh, but it's warm. And in the bleak heart of medieval winter, warmth outranks every other consideration. The woolen tunic still scratches at your skin, the furs are heavy across your shoulders, but even then you feel a chill creeping in. The draft snakes through gaps in the shutters and along the cracks in the timber walls. That is when you notice the bed itself isn't simply a flat pallet, it is a structure, a small world built to trap heat. Curtains are drawn around it, heavy cloth draped from wooden frames, creating a cocoon within a cocoon. Manuscripts and household records show that many medieval families, even those outside the nobility, used bed curtains. They weren't purely decorative, they were essential tools for warmth. In a chamber where smoke drifted lazily from a hearth and windows leaked winter air, enclosing the bed in fabric turned it into a tent of survival. The moment the curtains dropped, the space shrank to a pocket of body heat. You imagine yourself lying inside such a curtained bed. The fabric is coarse wool or perhaps linen lined with fur. It smells faintly of smoke, perhaps because it was hung close to the hearth earlier to dry. Once drawn, the curtains muffle sound, so the howl of the wind becomes distant, almost like waves on a far shore. The flickering candle outside dims to a softer glow, and the cold air stops its relentless crawl across your face. Within moments, you feel the warmth building. An odd little custom emerges from surviving descriptions. Children sometimes played hide and seek among these curtains during the day, transforming what was a survival necessity at night into a playhouse of sorts. You can picture it: the giggle of a child, the ripple of fabric as they duck inside, and the exasperated voice of a parent reminding them that these drapes aren't toys, they're protection. Experts continue to discuss how common elaborate curtained beds were among different social classes. Some argue that only the wealthy had fully enclosed four-poster beds with ornate hangings, while rural households managed with simple wooden frames and whatever cloth they could spare. Others point to wills and inventories suggesting middling families invested in at least partial hangings, a sign that warmth was worth the expense. The surviving furniture from the period supports both views. A spectrum of solutions, from rough sheets tacked to beams to elaborate canopies carved and gilded. The sensory experience of a curtained bed is easy to conjure. The air grows still, heavy with the mingled scent of wool, sweat, and rush matting. The sound of breath echoes softly, as if you're inside a cave. Outside, you hear muffled voices, footsteps, or the restless shuffle of an animal. But in your little cocoon, everything is hushed. The world contracts until all you know is warmth, fabric brushing against your cheek, and the steady rise and fall of someone's chest beside you. Curtains also granted a rare illusion of privacy. In households where a single chamber served multiple functions, the curtained bed was the closest thing to a room of one's own. Imagine living with siblings, parents, and servants all within arm's reach, then drawing the drapes and suddenly inhabiting a secluded darkness. Lovers whispered behind them, children told secrets, and travelers clutched their purses more tightly. For many, the curtain wasn't just fabric, it was a boundary, however thin, between self and world. In noble chambers, the curtains became symbols of prestige. Tapestries of hunting scenes or saints hung around the bed, embroidered by skilled hands, glowing with color even in dim candlelight. Servants carefully arranged them each evening, pulling them shut like stagehands before a play. To sleep in such a bed was to perform wealth as much as to preserve heat. You might imagine a lord reclining under embroidered saints, his breath visible in the chill air, while beyond the fabric his guards huddled on benches with only rough cloaks. There is something profoundly psychological about the curtain's embrace. The medieval night was not silent or empty. It was full of creaks, rustles, distant dogs barking, owls calling, the whistle of wind, and perhaps even the unsettling cries of neighbors. Enclosing yourself in a small cave of fabric dulled those sounds. The human mind, desperate for rest, clung to that muffled stillness as much as to the warmth. You can feel it now, the sense of being swaddled not only in cloth but in calm. Another curious note: some beds were built into the wall itself, like box beds with sliding shutters instead of curtains. These alcoves turned sleeping into almost a burrowing act, crawling inside a wooden compartment and shutting yourself in. The effect was the same: warmth, privacy, and a sense of security. Travelers described them with wonder, both fascinated and unnerved, as if entering a coffin where you hoped to emerge alive with morning light. You run your hand along the fabric in your imagination, feeling its rough weave under your fingertips, catching occasionally on loose threads. The curtain sways slightly as someone else climbs into bed, sending a shiver of cold air inside for a brief moment before the warmth returns. The heavy air smells of wool, human breath, and maybe even the faint resin of smoke trapped in the fibers. You close your eyes, and the sensation is one of retreat. The outside world still howls with frost, but here, in this enclosed shadow, you are defended. And that is the quiet genius of medieval ingenuity. Not inventing central heating, not conquering the cold entirely, but building tiny strongholds of survival within hostile nights. Each curtain, each alcove, each improvised fabric wall was less about luxury than about carving out a space where warmth could grow and fear could ebb. It wasn't elegance, it was endurance, woven from cloth and hope. The cloth walls of the bed fall silent around you, but the warmth is fleeting. Beyond those curtains, the larger room is still cold, and the fire that once blazed so brightly is now only a glow of fading embers. In many homes, the hearth was the true heart of the household, not only for cooking, but also for survival through the night. Where you sleep depends on where the fire is, and for countless families that meant huddling close to it, or even on the floor beside it, in order to keep breathing warmth on nights that could otherwise claim a life. Chroniclers from the time often note how peasants and servants gravitated toward the hearth at night, especially when space or bedding was scarce. With no feather beds or layered furs, the proximity to fire was the only insulation. Imagine lying on rushes spread across the flagstone floor, your head inches away from the smouldering logs, your face warm while your back remains chilled. The crackle of wood becomes the lullaby, and the faint hiss of sap bursting in the flames marks the rhythm of your drifting sleep. One eccentric habit recorded in travel accounts tells of people placing entire benches or trestle tables beside the hearth and sleeping atop them. The wood raised them away from the damp floor while keeping them close enough to the fire's warmth. It wasn't elegant, but it meant fewer chilblains come morning. You can almost feel the hardness of the table beneath your shoulder blades, the air smoky and heavy with ash, your nose stinging but your fingers thankful for the heat. Experts still disagree about how safe or common this practice really was. Some argue that families routinely slept so close to the flames that sparks occasionally set bedding alight, while others suggest that most people only dared to approach when the fire had burned low to embers. Archaeological evidence of scorched floorboards and hearth arrangements gives hints, but not certainty. What is clear is that desperation sometimes outweighed caution. Close your eyes and sense the details. The air is thick with the smell of wood smoke, clinging to hair, clothes, and blankets until it becomes part of you. Sparks occasionally pop, sending a brief spray of orange into the dark. Shadows leap across the walls, giving the room an almost enchanted, or perhaps haunted feel. The warmth of the fire lulls you, but every now and then a log shifts, and a harsh glow flares across your face, waking you enough to check that nothing has caught flame nearby. Sleep is never deep here. It is guarded, tentative, a bargain struck with the fire. In wealthier households, the hearth took different forms. Great halls featured enormous fireplaces where entire logs, sometimes so large they required several men to carry, burned through the night. But even then, the heat rarely reached the far corners of the room. Servants often rolled out bedding near the blaze, creating rows of bodies lying like spokes around a wheel, with the fire at the centre. Meanwhile, the lord and lady withdrew to curtained beds in adjacent chambers, still chilled but cushioned by tapestries and braziers. The irony is palpable. The servants sometimes slept warmer by the fire than their masters in draughty stone rooms. For monasteries, the rules were stricter. Monks were expected to endure the cold with discipline, sleeping in unheated dormitories on hard pallets. Yet even there, the hearth sometimes played a quiet role. Accounts from northern monasteries describe brothers sneaking into kitchens or infirmaries at night to warm themselves briefly by the embers, breaking the strict code but preserving their health. You can almost imagine the soft shuffle of sandals on stone, the whisper of robes, and the guilty relief as hands stretch toward faint glowing coals. There is another side to this closeness with fire: the risks. Many medieval records mention cottages that burned in the night, flames catching on rush mats or timber beams. The very source of warmth could also be the bringer of death. Families who slept by the hearth lived with that awareness every evening, balancing the relief of heat with the dread of waking to smoke and chaos. The scent of charred wood in the morning air was a reminder to every neighbor of the gamble inherent in firelit sleep. And yet, the fire held more than physical significance. It carried a sense of protection, almost spiritual. In folklore, embers were believed to ward off spirits of the night. Letting a hearth go cold was seen as both dangerous to health and unlucky. Families carefully banked the fire before sleep, covering embers with ash to keep them glowing until dawn. Picture a parent raking coals carefully, murmuring a small prayer, and then leading children to lie nearby. The embers became not just heat but guardians of the home. The sensory world of such nights is vivid. You feel the grit of ash beneath your hands, hear the soft whistle of wind sucked into the chimney, taste smoke lingering on your tongue. Someone snores softly beside you, another coughs as the air grows thick. Outside, wolves may howl in the distance, but their cries are muffled by the steady hum of fire. You curl tighter, adjusting so that your toes reach the warmest circle of heat, while your back bristles against the cold seeping through the floor. It's imperfect, uncomfortable, but compared to frostbite, it feels like luxury. Think of the small child who drifts to sleep with the glow of embers reflecting in wide eyes, believing that as long as the fire lives, morning will come. Think of the elderly peasant who stirs through the night, shifting closer each time the warmth fades, muttering in his sleep about wood shortages. Think of the exhausted traveler who collapses on the floor of a stranger's kitchen, content to rest in smoke and shadow because at least it is not the open road. You realize that for medieval people, the hearth was not simply furniture or technology, it was an axis of life itself. By day, it cooked meals. By night, it preserved breath. Its crackle was the sound of survival. Its smoke, the scent of belonging. To sleep beside it was to acknowledge both the fragility and resilience of existence in a world where cold could kill as surely as hunger. And so you settle there in your imagination, a thin blanket pulled around your shoulders, body curled toward the glowing coals. The warmth caresses one side of your face while the other side stiffens in the chill. Sleep comes in fragments, broken by sparks and shifts of wood, but still it comes. The fire murmurs softly, a lullaby older than memory, and the frost beyond the door remains, at least for tonight, on the outside. The glow of embers fades behind your eyes, as you imagine yourself waking in a different dwelling, not a smoky peasant hut, but a towering stone castle. At first glance, you might expect a lord's household to enjoy perfect warmth, wrapped in luxury, insulated from the misery outside. Yet, as you push open the heavy oak door, a blast of icy air greets you. The truth is that castles were colder than most cottages, their stone walls vast, draughty, and slow to warm. Comfort here came not from architecture, but from ingenuity, and from the relentless layering of cloth and fire. Records from estate inventories remind us that great halls were fitted with enormous fireplaces, sometimes large enough for a person to stand inside. Logs thicker than a man's thigh burned brightly, yet their heat spread only a few feet before dissipating into cold stone. Beyond the dancing light, shadows clung to corners. High ceilings trapped smoke above, leaving the people below in a chill gloom. Imagine feasting in such a space, your breath visible even as roasted meats steam on the table, the tips of your fingers still numb, despite the blaze roaring nearby. One curious detail noted in accounts is the use of portable braziers, metal baskets filled with charcoal or glowing coals that were carried into chambers to add localized warmth. Servants lugged them from the main hearth, careful not to spill sparks onto rushes. Picture a noblewoman lifting her skirts to warm her feet over a brazier while still shivering beneath multiple layers of linen and fur. The air smells of iron, ash, and faint sulphur as the charcoal smoulders. Its warmth in miniature, just enough to trick your body into relaxing. Specialists still disagree on how effective these measures truly were. Some argue that wall hangings, tapestries, and wooden paneling transformed otherwise frigid chambers into reasonably cozy quarters. Others suggest these were mere symbolic comforts, with drafts still pouring through arrow slits and under doors. The debate continues, but all agree that the great stone walls absorbed cold like sponges and radiated it back long into the night. Imagine stepping into a noble's bedchamber. The walls are hung with heavy tapestries depicting hunting scenes or religious motifs, meant not only for display but as insulation. The floor is scattered with rushes, sprinkled with herbs to mask the odors of damp and smoke. At the center stands a massive bed, tall and carved, with curtains drawn tight. You climb onto its feather-stuffed mattress, sinking deep, only to find that your nose still stings from icy air. Even within this private haven, the castle remains a cave of stone, indifferent to your comfort. A peculiar practice, sometimes mentioned in household manuals, was warming linens before sleep. Servants laid blankets near the fire, or even pressed heated irons across them, delivering a bed that glowed faintly with heat for the first precious minutes. You can almost feel it now, slipping between sheets that radiate warmth, only to have that glow vanish swiftly, leaving you curled tight once more. It's a fleeting luxury, gone almost as soon as you notice it. There's also the social hierarchy within this icy grandeur. Lords and ladies occupied chambers with braziers and fur-draped beds, while their guards and servants often slept in passageways, guardrooms, or directly in the great hall. Imagine a row of men-at-arms stretched out on benches, cloaks pulled tight, the sound of armor clinking softly each time they shift. Their breath rises in clouds, mingling with the faint scent of ale still spilled on the floor from the evening's feast. They are warmer than peasants, perhaps, but hardly immune to the bite of frost. The sensory contrasts sharpen as you dwell on them. Touch, the coarse weave of a wall tapestry, rough beneath your hand, yet warmer than bare stone. Sound, the distant howl of wind funneled through arrow slits, whistling like a mournful tune. Smell, the acrid smoke of charcoal mixing with the musk of damp fur rugs. Sight, your breath floating before you in a chamber supposedly designed for comfort. It is a paradox: you live surrounded by wealth, but you are never free from the cold's quiet dominion. One account from a visiting merchant describes waking in a noble's castle with frost clinging to the inside of his window shutters. He claimed that the water in his wash basin had frozen solid overnight, and that even 3 blankets and a fur mantle could not prevent his teeth from chattering. It's a vivid reminder that grandeur did not guarantee comfort, and that even the wealthy learned to endure winter nights with stoicism. And yet, there is something almost majestic about this endurance. Picture a grand feast ending in laughter, the fire reduced to embers, the company dispersing to their chambers. Servants hurry to bank coals, to draw curtains, to carry braziers. Lords retreat to curtained beds layered with pelts, while guards stomp their feet to keep warm through long watches. The cold unites them all, a silent adversary that cares nothing for title or wealth. The symbolism of cold in castles runs deep. Stone embodies permanence, strength, and fortification, yet it also traps you in a prison of chill. Every effort to counter it, furs, braziers, tapestries, is an acknowledgement that power cannot banish nature. Even kings went to bed with red noses and stiff fingers, their crowns powerless against frost. You lie back in your mind's eye, inside a curtained castle bed, feeling the layered weight of quilts and furs pressing down. The air within is stuffy, heavy with breath, but beyond the fabric the chamber remains vast and cold. You drift in the knowledge that despite all human effort, winter still rules the night. And in that realization lies a strange comfort. Endurance itself is victory, whether you are peasant by a hearth or lord behind embroidered curtains. The castle walls fade from your imagination, and you find yourself back in a lowly cottage, pressed close to the straw mattress that creaks beneath too many bodies. In this world, warmth isn't evenly shared. It's carefully arranged, parceled out by age, size, and duty. Children are tucked into place like living coals in a fire, and parents form the outer ring. The family bed is not just about rest, it is an architecture of survival. Household accounts and folklore make it clear that younger children often slept at the foot of the bed, their small bodies gathered near their parents' legs. In some cases, infants were swaddled tightly and nestled right beside their mothers, while older siblings curled closer to their father's feet. The reasoning was practical. Small bodies produce less heat, but absorb warmth quickly, so arranging them like warm stones helped maintain balance across the bed. Picture it now. A mother lies in the center, her arm draped across a bundled infant, while two children nestle against her hips. At the far end, near the parent's feet, a boy curls tight, his head pressed against rough wool socks, taking in heat like a sponge. It is not glamorous, but it is effective. The bed becomes a living circuit, with warmth passing from one body to another in silent, unconscious exchange. One unusual practice occasionally mentioned in parish records is that children were sometimes used deliberately as foot warmers. Parents admitted half in jest that placing a child at their feet made the night more bearable. Imagine drifting to sleep with your toes pressed against a squirming, half-asleep toddler, who in turn sought the comfort of adult warmth. To us it sounds unfair, but to them it was simply part of family duty. Researchers still debate how widespread this practice truly was. Some argue that children were always given the warmest place, at the very center of the bed, while others note accounts of little ones shivering on the edges. The truth likely shifted with household needs. In the dead of winter, practicality often trumped tenderness. Love was not absent, it was simply expressed through the shared survival of the group. The sensory details of such nights linger vividly in the imagination. Small limbs pressing against your side, a child's breath hot on your cheek, the faint whimper when a blanket slips away. Parents stirred constantly, pulling covers back into place, soothing murmurs whispered in the dark. The smell was a mingling of wool, sweat, and childhood. Sour milk, damp straw, and the faint sweetness of hair washed weeks ago. You inhale, and the scent is overwhelming, both unpleasant and deeply human. In noble households, the arrangement could be just as intimate. Accounts describe wet nurses, servants, and even favored children sharing beds with their mistresses. A noblewoman might keep an infant beside her under rich quilts, while older children slept with attendants. The placement of each sleeper reflected hierarchy as much as warmth. Those closest to the mother or mistress were prized, while others lay at the margins. Even in castles, the foot of the bed was crowded. There's also a psychological dimension to this layering of generations. Sleep was not solitary, it was communal, woven into the rhythm of family life. Children grew up accustomed to hearing their parents breathing, their siblings shifting bodies, the occasional murmur of conversation before drifting off. Privacy was nearly unknown, but intimacy was constant. The bed was not just furniture, it was the cradle of memory, the place where songs were sung, stories whispered, fears soothed. Imagine the sounds of such a night. A lullaby hummed softly, a child coughing, the shuffle of small feet trying to find a warmer spot. A parent's hand pats in the dark, settling disputes without words. The blanket rustles as someone turns, pulling the cover tighter, leaving another momentarily exposed. It is a choreography of sleep, endlessly adjusted, endlessly negotiated. And there are darker notes too. Records remind us that accidental suffocation was not unknown. With so many bodies pressed together, infants sometimes slipped beneath heavy covers or were crushed in restless shifting. Priests and midwives warned mothers to be vigilant, but in a world without alternatives, the risks were tolerated. The very act of huddling for warmth carried its own dangers. A peculiar custom emerges from some rural traditions. Children were told ghost stories at night to keep them still in bed. Parents warned that if they wriggled or kicked off covers, spirits would snatch them away. The tales served less as supernatural truth and more as a method to enforce stillness in a crowded sleeping space. You can almost hear the stern whisper, "Lie still, or the night hag will find you." Fear kept the blankets in place when discipline alone could not. The sight of it all stays with you. A heap of blankets, patched together from wool and hide, draped over a mound of bodies, little faces peeking out like flowers in a tangled meadow. To modern eyes it looks chaotic, unhygienic, even cruel, but for them, it was safety. Every small body at the foot of the bed was proof that warmth was being shared, that the family had endured another night together. And so you curl tighter in your imagination, feeling the nudge of a child's heel against your chest, the muffled giggle when someone whispers a joke in the dark, the soft sigh of a mother pulling the blanket back up. The cold outside still presses at the walls, relentless, but inside this crowded, noisy cocoon, warmth survives. It is fragile, fleeting, imperfect, but it is enough. The muffled giggles of children at the foot of the bed fade in your imagination, and you drift to another survival trick, one that doesn't involve bodies or furs but rather the careful manipulation of heat itself. On the coldest nights, when every breath frosted the air and even layered clothing couldn't banish the chill, families turned to an ingenious solution, heating stones or bricks in the fire, then carrying that warmth into bed like a captured piece of the sun. Household manuals and archaeological finds both attest to this practice. Smooth stones or thick bricks were left near the hearth until they glowed with invisible heat, then wrapped in cloth or tucked into wooden boxes to prevent burns. Slipped under blankets, they radiated comfort for hours. You can imagine the relief of pressing your feet against one after a day of trudging through icy mud, the sudden wave of warmth trickling up your body, almost enough to make you forget the draft at your neck. One particularly odd detail survives from rural accounts. Some families used hollowed-out clay jars filled with embers, sealed with a lid, to serve as makeshift bed warmers. They glowed faintly in the dark, giving off both heat and a thin ribbon of smoke. The smell of scorched clay and ash would have lingered under the covers. Picture the mixed sensation, a cozy warmth at your toes paired with the acrid tang of fire in your nose. Comfort, always tinged with discomfort. Researchers remain divided over how widespread these bed warmers truly were. Some argue that only households with surplus fuel could afford to risk wasting heat on stones instead of meals. Others note that even the poorest cottages likely had access to rocks and embers, making it a common trick in regions with brutal winters. The truth probably lies somewhere in between, a simple solution, improvised differently depending on wealth and geography. You lean into the sensory imagery. The stone wrapped in ragged cloth is rough beneath your fingers, edges warm enough to sting. You tuck it at your feet, sighing as the heat seeps into aching toes. The smell of smoke clings faintly to the linen, reminding you that this warmth was stolen from the fire only moments before. For a while, you can sleep without curling into a ball. In noble households, the practice evolved into elegance. Servants carried polished brass or copper pans filled with coals, sliding them between layers of bedding to warm the sheets before their lords retired. Imagine the hissing sound as a hot pan skimmed across linen, the faint scorch marks left behind if the servant lingered too long. The bed itself smelled faintly metallic, a reminder of the device that transformed icy sheets into fleeting warmth. Guests remarked on this practice with envy, though some also warned of accidents. An overturned pan could set a bed ablaze faster than anyone could react. The fire's danger always hovered nearby. Bed warmers, though comforting, sometimes sparked small blazes. Chroniclers record tales of cottages igniting in the night, flames racing across straw mattresses because a stone cracked or a jar tipped. Families weighed the risk against the relief, and almost always the relief won. You can picture a mother whispering a quick prayer before sliding the warm stone under her children's blanket, hoping it would last until dawn without incident. The psychological comfort of such objects cannot be underestimated. A child clutching a heated brick beneath layers of wool would feel safer, more assured that the night could be endured. The stone became more than warmth, it was a talisman, a reminder that the family had power, however small, against the vast cold outside. Even after the heat faded, the memory of it soothed the mind, enough to lull restless bodies into sleep. Consider the sounds of such nights. A father pokes at the hearth with an iron rod, selecting the right stone. The crackle of embers sends sparks dancing. The hiss of cloth meeting heat echoes softly. Then the shuffling steps as the stone is carried across the room, careful not to drop it. Children sit up eagerly, waiting for their turn to feel its glow. The whole ritual becomes almost ceremonial, a moment of shared relief before settling down again. Another curious note: in some regions, people believed that heated stones carried not just warmth, but healing properties. They pressed them against aching joints or stomachs, hoping the absorbed fire would draw out illness. Sleeping with such a stone under the covers was seen as both practical and medicinal. Imagine a grandmother clutching one to her chest, murmuring about its soothing power, while her grandchildren giggle at how tightly she hugs it. The contrast with modern conveniences is sharp. We have hot water bottles, electric blankets, and radiators that hum without thought. But here, in the medieval night, every scrap of heat is earned. You rise from your straw pallet, barefoot on cold rushes, to choose a stone, heat it, and guard it against cracking. You carry it like treasure, cautious and reverent, because it is the only thing standing between you and the icy silence. As the night deepens in your imagination, you curl tighter under blankets, your toes pressed against the fading warmth of the stone. The fire across the room has sunk to embers, and frost creeps silently along the window frame. But beneath the covers, you still feel the ghost of heat, the last remnants of captured fire. It lulls you, steadies you, lets you drift into uneasy dreams. And when you stir hours later, feet cold again, you reach instinctively for the stone, even though it has gone long since cold. That gesture, that unconscious seeking of warmth long after it is gone, captures something essential about medieval winter nights. Comfort was always fleeting, always improvised, always fragile, yet it was enough. Each stone, each ember, each fading glow carried people through, night after night, until spring finally returned. The warmth of the stone fades, and in your imagination you hear a low murmur of voices, the scrape of a wooden cup against the table. Before slipping under blankets, many families fortified themselves with drink. It wasn't only ritual, it was survival. Ale, cider, mulled wine, these were not indulgences but shields against the gnawing cold. Alcohol was believed to warm the blood, and in the biting dark of a January night, that belief was powerful enough to shape bedtime routines across medieval Europe. Contemporary records show that even children drank small ale, a weak beer brewed to be safer than water and mild enough for daily use. By night, adults often consumed stronger brews or warmed them with spices, honey, or herbs. Imagine sitting by the fire, a wooden mug in your hands, the liquid steaming faintly, cinnamon and cloves masking the bitterness. You take a sip, and the warmth spreads down your throat, blooming into your chest. For a few minutes, the chill loosens its grip. One curious tradition survives in descriptions of winter feasts. Monks and townsfolk alike sometimes poured hot ale or wine over toasted bread, creating a soupy concoction known as a posset. Sweetened with honey and thickened by the bread, It filled the belly while dulling the mind into drowsiness. You can almost taste it now. Sweet, grainy, heavy, and feel your eyelid grow heavier with each spoonful. Not exactly delicious by modern standards, but effective in pushing you towards sleep. Historians remain divided on whether alcohol truly improved warmth or simply created the illusion of it. Some argue that the temporary flush of heat was outweighed by long-term cooling of the body. Others suggest that, in moderation, strong drink provided enough calories and comfort to make a difference. The debate lingers, but what is certain is that countless medieval people trusted the effect enough to risk their health for the promise of a warmer night. The sensory details of such evenings are easy to imagine. The tang of yeast rises from the mug, earthy and pungent. Your lips sting slightly from the hot rim. The liquid sits heavy in your stomach, coating it with warmth that feels almost physical, almost protective. Around you, family members murmur softly, their voices softened by the drink. The fire crackles, shadows sway across the walls, and the cold outside feels a little less threatening. In noble households, the drinks grew more elaborate. Mulled wine infused with exotic spices like nutmeg or imported sugar transformed the act into both warmth and display. Picture a lord holding a golden goblet, the steam curling above the rim, the air filled with the sharp perfume of cloves. Servants shuffle forward with pitchers to refill, while guests laugh more loudly than they should. The cold remains, seeping under doors and through arrow slits, but for a few hours the illusion of warmth is sustained. Oddly enough, bedtime drinks were sometimes paired with religious blessings. Some parish priests recommended a final sip of ale before sleep, invoking God's protection alongside the physical heat. Others warned against overindulgence, equating drunkenness with sin. The tension between necessity and morality played out nightly, as men and women justified their cups as medicine rather than vice. You can almost hear the muttered prayers, half sincere, half excuses. Consider the social aspect too. Sharing ale before bed bound families together, in the same way that sharing a blanket did. Cups were passed around, stories exchanged, laughter muffled under the low smoke-filled rafters. For children, the sweetened dregs might serve as a treat, a final comfort before crawling into the crowded bed. For adults, the ritual provided not only warmth, but the reassurance that no one faced the night alone. The hazards were real. Chroniclers noted that drunkards sometimes fell asleep too close to the fire, their clothes or bedding catching alight. Others froze in barns or fields after stumbling outside, lulled into a false sense of warmth. Yet even with such risks, the practice endured. In an age without central heating, a hot drink was worth the gamble. Imagine the sounds of such a night. A father coughs after swallowing too quickly. His children giggle. A mother hums a tune, her voice soft, as she stirs herbs into the pot. The clink of wooden mugs echoes, the scrape of ladles against iron cauldrons, the slosh of liquid pouring into cups. The fire pops, sparks fly, and the bitter wind outside is briefly forgotten. The psychological weight of this ritual is just as important as the physical. Drinking something warm before sleep tells your body that you are cared for, that there is comfort in the dark. Even if the actual warmth fades quickly, the memory of it lingers, carrying you across the threshold into dreams. The medieval night was full of uncertainty, wolves outside, spirits imagined, hunger gnawing, but in that shared sip, there was reassurance. You close your eyes, the taste of spiced ale still on your tongue. Your body is heavier, your thoughts slower. Around you, the family stirs, pulling blankets closer, sighing into sleep. The embers glow faintly. The mugs rest empty on the table. Outside, frost coats the earth, but inside, the warmth of drink and company carries you just far enough to believe you will survive until morning. The dregs of spiced ale linger on your tongue as you lie back, your body heavy with warmth that will not last. Beneath you, the mattress shifts and creaks. It is no feather bed, no down-stuffed quilt, it is straw, layered thickly on a wooden frame or sometimes on the bare floor itself. For peasants across Europe, This was the standard bed, replaced and refilled as often as harvests allowed. Accounts from manorial records and household manuals confirm that straw, hay, or bundles of dried rushes formed the most common sleeping surface for ordinary families. These materials were readily available, easy to gather, and, at least for a short while, offered insulation against the frozen ground. Fresh straw crackled beneath the body, releasing a faint, grassy smell, almost sweet. It was a comfort for the first nights, before damp and wear set in. One peculiar habit, often mentioned in medieval housekeeping notes, is the seasonal changing of the straw. In many places, rushes were replaced 2 or 3 times a year, sometimes ceremonially as part of a household cleaning. By midwinter, however, the once springy bed was flattened, grimy, and crawling with insects. Imagine lying down on such a surface, the straw flattened into hard ridges, the smell no longer fresh but sour, tinged with mold and sweat. Still, it was better than biting stone floor. Scholars continue to discuss how effective these straw beds really were. Some argue that, when kept dry and replenished, they provided decent insulation, lifting the sleeper above the cold ground. Others insist they were little more than nests for fleas and vermin, spreading discomfort more than warmth. Archaeological digs at medieval sites uncover compacted rushes that hint at both possibilities. The line between comfort and infestation was often only a matter of maintenance. The sensory experience is easy to picture. You roll onto your side, the straw crunching beneath you, a sharp stalk poking at your hip. Dust rises with each shift, tickling your nose, making you sneeze softly into the dark. The smell of hay still lingers faintly, mixed now with smoke and the musk of bodies. It is not pleasant, but it is familiar, and familiarity itself carries comfort in a world with so little certainty. A curious twist emerges in some documents. Wealthier peasants sometimes mixed herbs into their straw, not only for fragrance, but to repel insects. Lavender, mint, or wormwood leaves might be scattered among the rushes. Imagine lying down on such a bed, the faint aroma of mint cutting through the heavier smells of smoke and sweat. It's a small luxury, improvised from what nature offered. For a few nights, at least, you could breathe easier. Contrast that with noble households. Their straw mattresses were layered within linen ticks, fabric cases sewn shut to contain the filling. Servants refilled and restuffed these regularly, ensuring a softer, longer-lasting bed. The rustle of straw was muted, the smell contained. Nobles might never feel the sharp jab of a stalk, shielded by linen and additional padding. Yet even in castles, straw remained the hidden foundation beneath the silks and quilts. The difference lay not in what was inside the bed, but how it was wrapped and renewed. The symbolic meaning of straw beds also lingers in medieval culture. To be laid in straw was a phrase associated with poverty, humility, even childbirth. Christ himself, in the Nativity story, was described as laid in a manger of hay. That image resonated powerfully in an age where straw was the most common bedding. It was both a literal reality and a spiritual metaphor, a reminder that survival through cold nights bound peasants and nobles alike. Think of the sounds of such nights: the creak of the wooden frame beneath shifting bodies, the crunch of stalks breaking under pressure, the faint rustle each time someone rolls over, sending dust into the air. Occasionally, a small squeak betrays the presence of mice nesting beneath, bold enough to share the warmth. Sleep here is never silent, never pristine. It is layered with the living world. Yet there is also tenderness hidden in the straw. Parents tucked children into the softest part, near the center. Couples carved out space for themselves in the lumpy surface, creating a hollow molded to their bodies. A child might giggle as stalks pricked their neck, only to be hushed by a tired parent. These details, mundane to them, now paint a vivid picture of resilience. Another curious note: travelers often carried small bundles of straw in their packs, to ensure they had a clean layer wherever they slept. Imagine arriving at an inn, spreading your own straw on the floor beside strangers, claiming a little island of warmth in the crowded room. The rustle of dozens of bundles being laid out must have been a nightly chorus in medieval hostels. As you imagine yourself lying down now, the straw shifts again beneath your weight. It is lumpy, uneven, but warmer than stone, and that is all that matters. The covers above you may be threadbare, the room draughty, but at least you are not on frozen earth. The mattress breathes with you, whispering with each turn, its imperfections a constant reminder that survival is never smooth or silent. You close your eyes, pressing your cheek against a linen sack stuffed with rushes, inhaling its faint grassy ghost. Outside, the wind still lashes the walls, but here, on your humble bed of straw, you find enough warmth to drift into uneasy but necessary dreams. The straw mattress rustles beneath you, and for a moment the thought of warmth seems enough. But then the door creaks open, and you realize you're not the only ones searching for heat. On the road, in monasteries, and in taverns across Europe, communal sleeping halls drew travelers, pilgrims, servants, and monks together in tight dormitories. To our modern eyes, the idea of sharing a room and sometimes even a bed with strangers feels awkward, maybe even alarming. Yet in the medieval night, closeness was not a choice, it was necessity. Chroniclers of the period describe large halls where dozens might unroll bedding side by side, lying shoulder to shoulder on straw-strewn floors or narrow pallets. In monasteries, the rule of silence extended even into the dormitory, rows of monks laid out in disciplined symmetry. Picture it, a cavernous hall, dimly lit by oil lamps, the only sound the rustle of robes and the occasional cough. Each monk lies fully clothed, hood pulled over his head, his breath clouding faintly in the cold air. The room is austere, but the sheer mass of bodies generates a fragile warmth. In secular inns, the scene was far less orderly. Travellers arrived at dusk, weary and chilled, and were assigned space on a common floor or in shared beds. Wooden benches served as mattresses, straw was piled in corners, and blankets were often borrowed rather than owned. You imagine the smells: sweat from labourers, smoke from the hearth, the tang of wet wool drying by the fire. Snores mix with muttered dreams. The warmth here is real, but so is the chaos. One striking detail appears in the accounts of foreign visitors to England. They were astonished by the practice of bundling, where unrelated travellers were tucked under the same covers. A merchant might find himself nose to nose with a stranger by morning, an arrangement neither romantic nor polite, but simply efficient. Imagine climbing into a bed, boots still on, cloak wrapped tight, only to realize someone you've never met is already curled at the other end. You shift, grumble, then surrender to sleep. Heat outweighs embarrassment. Specialists continue to debate just how common bed sharing with strangers really was. Some argue that inns almost always doubled up guests due to limited space, while others suggest that wealthier travelers could pay for private arrangements. Both views are plausible, and both reveal the fragility of comfort in a world where hospitality meant survival. To be refused a bed, or worse, to be refused space on the floor, could be a death sentence in the middle of winter. The sensory detail of these communal spaces is vivid. The air grows thick with human breath, damp from dozens of lungs. Every cough reverberates, every sigh carries across the hall. The straw under you prickles against your cheek, and the blanket smells faintly of the last traveller who used it. Yet there is a peculiar reassurance in the crowd. Surrounded by bodies, you feel less exposed to the howling wind outside. For monks, the communal dormitory had an added layer of discipline. They rose together in the night for prayers, filing silently from their pallets into the chapel. Imagine being jolted from uneasy sleep by the toll of a bell, the dormitory suddenly alive with movement, feet shuffling on cold stone, torches flaring. The warmth of sleep is gone. replaced by the solemn duty of chanting in a frigid choir. The rhythm of devotion overtakes the rhythm of rest. A curious note from some monastic rules. Blankets were sometimes rationed by rank. Senior monks received thicker coverings, while novices shivered under thinner cloth. The arrangement reinforced hierarchy even in sleep, a reminder that obedience extended beyond the daylight hours. You can picture a novice pulling his cloak tighter, teeth chattering, as he glances enviously at the older brother dozing peacefully beneath heavy wool. In inns, hierarchy took shape in coin. Wealthier travellers bought better spaces closer to the fire, away from drafty doors. The poor were pushed to the edges, where frost crept in and straw grew damp. Imagine lying there, half asleep, hearing laughter from the wealthy merchant warm by the hearth, while you huddle at the far wall, your blanket thin, your body stiff. Fairness had little place in survival. Yet communal halls also held a strange intimacy. Stories were exchanged before sleep, songs sung softly in the dark, prayers murmured aloud. Strangers became companions for a night, their shared discomfort binding them. The smell of smoke and ale, the flicker of lamplight, the sound of rain hammering on the roof, all became part of a shared experience, remembered later with a mixture of distaste and nostalgia. Consider the dangers, too. Crowded dormitories were breeding grounds for lice, fleas, and disease. English sweat, plague, or even simple colds spread easily. A single cough might echo into sickness across the entire hall. Travellers risked more than awkwardness when they agreed to share a bed, they risked their health. And yet, in winter, refusing the warmth of another body was often unthinkable. The psychological impact of such nights is worth imagining. In modern times, privacy is sacred, and solitude in sleep is expected. But here, your very survival depends on giving up that privacy, surrendering your space, and trusting strangers not to harm you. Sleep becomes an act of faith, a gamble that those lying beside you are as desperate for rest as you are. Now, close your eyes. Feel the press of bodies around you, the rustle of straw, the soft hum of snores. Someone coughs, another shifts and mutters in their dream. The fire crackles weakly at the far end of the hall, its warmth reaching only a lucky few. The smell of smoke, sweat, and spilled ale mingles in the thick air. It is neither clean nor comfortable, but it is survivable. And in the medieval world, survival was the only luxury that truly mattered. The crowded inn fades in your mind, and suddenly you find yourself standing in front of a tiny, warped window in a timbered cottage. The wind pushes against it with a shrill whistle, as if trying to claw its way inside. Unlike the glass panes we take for granted today, medieval windows were fragile inventions, never fully sealed against the elements. The ingenuity of survival was not in keeping the cold out completely, but in softening its sharp edge. Documents from household accounts and surviving architecture reveal that many cottages had nothing more than shutters to cover their window openings. At night, these were pulled tight, sometimes stuffed with cloth or straw to block the drafts. But in households with a little more wealth, the openings were covered with stretched parchment soaked in oil, or thin slices of horn scraped translucent. These substitutes let in a ghostly glow of daylight but blocked the worst of the wind. Imagine standing by such a window at dawn, the horn panel glowing pale yellow, cold moisture beading on its surface, frost spreading delicate spiderwebs across the frame. One unusual method, mentioned in a few manorial surveys, was stuffing moss or rags into cracks around the shutters. Families treated the window like a wound that needed bandaging, plugging every gap they could find. You can picture it, hands pressing wet moss into place, the earthy smell clinging to the room, the green slowly darkening as it froze solid. Not pretty, but effective enough to let the family sleep without icy gusts on their necks. Experts still argue about how common horn windows truly were. Some claim they were a mark of middling wealth, reserved for prosperous townsfolk and minor gentry. Others believe they were more widespread, since horn was readily available from cattle, and parchment could be made from even modest resources. The truth, as so often, seems to blur between regions. What is certain is that glass, rare, expensive, and imported, was a luxury only the very wealthy could afford before the later Middle Ages. Step closer in imagination. Run your hand along the rough wood frame, the grain splintering against your palm. Press your fingers against the horn panel. It is cool, slightly greasy from its treatment, and faintly translucent. Through it, you see only vague shapes, the outline of a tree, the flicker of torchlight outside. The wind rattles the shutter, sending a low moan through the room, but at least it does not slice directly across your bed. The barrier is imperfect, but it is enough. A curious practice emerges from certain towns. Wealthier households used painted cloths as window coverings, decorated with flowers or biblical scenes. These acted as insulation and display at once, filtering sunlight through color during the day and keeping some of the night chill at bay. Imagine drifting to sleep with a faint glow of painted roses above your head, even as your breath frosts in the air. Art and survival woven together in one fragile surface. The smell of these coverings fills the chamber. Oiled parchment carries a faint animal tang, sharp and musky. Horn has its own sour note, stronger when the panel is warmed by the day's weak sun. Combined with the constant background of smoke, wool, and damp straw, the room becomes a cocktail of scents, unpleasant, yet familiar. For medieval sleepers, comfort meant not the absence of discomfort, but the ability to ignore it. And then there are the sounds. The wind presses at the shutters, rattling them like restless fingers. Rain spatters against the horn, making a muted drumming noise. Occasionally, frost cracks sharply as it forms, like the snap of breaking twigs. These noises seep into the dreams of those huddled inside, blending with the snores and murmurs of family members. The medieval night was never silent. It was alive with sound, filtered through fragile barriers. In castles and monasteries, windows were larger but not necessarily warmer. Arrow slits in fortresses funneled icy air inside, while cloisters echoed with draughts that no tapestry could entirely block. Monks slept in long rows under unglazed windows, their prayers to endurance as constant as their prayers to God. Nobles hung heavy tapestries or shutters of thick wood, but even then, frost crept across the stones by morning. The cold was an equalizer, humbling both peasant and lord. There is also symbolism in these fragile windows. They let in light but not clarity, protection but not comfort. To live behind parchment or horn was to accept life in shades, to endure imperfection. Sleepers knew the world beyond, but never saw it clearly until they opened the shutters. The medieval night was therefore a double darkness. First, the absence of sun, and second, the blurring of vision through imperfect panes. You imagine yourself lying back in the straw bed, the curtain drawn, the horn window glowing faintly with moonlight. The air seeping through cracks brushes across your cheek, cold and sharp. You pull the blanket tighter, bury your nose in wool, and listen to the wind's frustrated howl as it tries and fails to break in. The barrier may be thin, but tonight it holds. And that fragile triumph of cloth, horn, and human ingenuity is what lets you drift into sleep once more. The glow of the horn window lingers in your mind, pale and ghostly. When another reality intrudes, the night is never uninterrupted. You may finally grow drowsy under layers of wool and fur, only to be roused by the demands of the body or the duties of the household. Midnight was not a silent stretch of sleep for medieval families. It was a time of interruptions, of practical needs, and sometimes of burdensome obligations. Household accounts and medical writings of the era remind us that chamber pots were a nightly companion. Rising to relieve yourself meant leaving the fragile cocoon of warmth, and so families kept ceramic or wooden pots near the bed. You imagine the clumsy shuffle in the dark, the scrape of a lid being lifted, the sour smell rising briefly before the pot is slid back under the bed. It is a jarring intrusion on the cocoon of blankets and bodies. Yet without it, someone would need to trudge into the icy yard, a far harsher prospect. One curious practice described in a few chronicles is the use of communal pots in dormitories, especially in monasteries. Dozens of men relied on shared vessels, often emptied at dawn by novices. Picture it: a dark hall, the sound of feet padding across stone, the muffled clatter of pottery, and the faint odor that filled the air by morning. The silence of monastic discipline may have muffled complaints, but the discomfort was universal. Experts remain divided on how strictly people adhered to first sleep and second sleep, the segmented rhythm described in some texts. Some historians argue that waking around midnight was natural and widespread, while others believe it was more common in cities or wealthier homes. Regardless of theory, many medieval people did stir in the middle of the night, whether to use a chamber pot, to stoke the fire, or to say a quick prayer. Sleep was not an unbroken span, but a series of fragile intervals. Imagine the sensory details. You shift in the dark, pushing aside the heavy curtain around the bed. A breath of icy air hits your face instantly, shocking after the stuffy warmth inside. Your bare feet touch the floor, the rushes damp and cold. Each step is an ache. Somewhere nearby, an ember cracks in the hearth, sending up a faint orange spark. The chamber pot is cool to the touch, the glaze slick under your hands. Relief comes quickly, but the price is the chill that seeps into your bones before you scramble back under the covers. In households where fires had to be kept alive, someone rose in the night to bank the coals. The task fell often to servants or the father of the family. Imagine kneeling by the hearth, raking ashes over glowing embers, coaxing them to last until dawn. The smell of smoke fills your nostrils, your eyes sting, and your hands tremble from the cold. It is a wearying duty, but without it, the fire might die entirely, leaving the family to face morning with nothing but frost. There's a strange intimacy in these interruptions. In a communal bed, when one person stirs, others stir too. The blanket lifts, the draught seeps in, a groan echoes as someone mutters half-asleep complaints. Children may whimper, adults whisper reassurances. Then, as the body returns to warmth, the group settles again, the breathing rhythm resumes, and the fragile cocoon is restored. Sleep is a negotiation, constantly broken and remade. A peculiar anecdote from travelers' journals describes how some families used dogs to guard their chamber pots. In regions where theft or pranks were common in inns, animals were trained to bark if strangers crept near bedding at night. It's an odd image: a pot under the bed, a dog curled nearby, serving as both alarm system and foot warmer. Medieval practicality rarely wasted resources. For nobles, the interruptions carried a different flavor. Bedchambers sometimes doubled as semi-public spaces, with servants entering at all hours. A lady might be woken by an attendant checking on the fire, or by a nursemaid soothing an infant in the corner. Even kings were not immune. Henry VIII himself complained of cold nights disturbed by draughts and noise, despite his wealth. Imagine lying in a grand bed, curtains drawn, only to hear a servant's cautious footsteps and the clink of iron tools at the hearth. Sleep was rarely private, even at the highest ranks. The sounds of midnight intrusions echo in your mind: the scrape of iron against coals, the splash of liquid in a pot, the cough of a child, the sigh of someone shifting in straw. Outside, the wind howls steadily, but inside, the smaller noises of human necessity mark the true rhythm of the night. The medieval household never really slept all at once. It drifted in and out, one person's stirring always brushing against another's. And so, you curl back under the covers, your feet icy from the rushes, your breath misting faintly in the dark. Around you the family adjusts, pulling you back into the huddle. The warmth grows again, slowly, imperfectly. Sleep comes in fragments, but each fragment is enough. The night is long, but survival is stitched together one interruption at a time. The muffled shuffle of footsteps in the dark fades from your imagination, and once again you're inside that curtained bed, sharing breath with the people and animals around you. And then it hits you, the smell. It's everywhere. In the medieval night, warmth was always accompanied by odor, the mingling of human sweat, damp wool, smoky air, straw gone sour, and the musky presence of animals that doubled as heating companions. You cannot escape it, so you learn to live with it. Writings from visiting clerics and travelers often mention the pungency of common households. They describe entering cottages thick with smoke, where air barely moved and every fabric carried the same damp, acrid perfume. Imagine pulling a blanket up to your chin, the wool scratchy and stiff, and inhaling a cocktail of sheep's lanolin, ash, and unwashed bodies. To us, it's oppressive. To them, it was normal, the olfactory background of survival. One curious anecdote surfaces in a 14th century household manual. It suggested sprinkling crushed herbs, rosemary, sage, even dried rose petals onto rush mats and bedding to freshen the air. These scents were thought to repel pests as well as soften the stench of life. You picture a mother scattering handfuls of lavender across the straw, children laughing as the purple flowers crumble, the air briefly sweetened before the smoke swallows it up again. Experts continue to debate how sensitive medieval people were to smell. Some argue that constant exposure dulled their senses, that what seems intolerable to us barely registered to them. Others insist complaints in period texts about rank cottages or foul air prove people did notice and resent the odors. Either way, surviving the cold meant tolerating what clung to your bedding and clothing. Freshness was a fleeting luxury, traded for warmth. Close your eyes and lean into the sensory overload. The room is thick with breath. Every exhale lingers, heavy and moist, hanging in the air like fog. The dog at your feet shifts, releasing a musky puff of fur and dirt. Chickens roost above, feathers dropping onto the floor, their smell sharp and dusty. Someone coughs, and the stale scent of illness drifts through the crowded bed. It's not pleasant, but it is human, alive, proof that warmth hasn't abandoned you. For nobles, the smells were masked rather than absent. Perfumed sachets were tucked between linens, and incense was sometimes burned before bed. Imagine the scent of frankincense or myrrh mingling with wool and fur, creating an odd fusion of the sacred and the mundane. The attempt was to elevate sleep into something refined, yet even in a castle chamber, the underlying smell of smoke and sweat was impossible to erase completely. One strange practice recorded in medical texts was the belief that foul odors themselves could cause illness. Families sometimes cracked windows intentionally, even in winter, to let air circulate. Picture the paradox. You've spent hours plugging every draft with moss and rags, only to open a gap because you fear the stench will make you sick. Cold air floods in, but you breathe easier, believing you've driven away miasma. The psychological side of scent is powerful here. Warmth becomes linked to smell comfort, tied not to cleanliness but to familiarity. Children learn to associate the musky odor of straw and wool with safety, even love. A traveler entering an inn might recoil at the stink, but after an hour he too relaxed, accepting the mixture of odors as proof of shared humanity. Smell, as much as heat, reminded people they were not alone. Listen to the sounds layered over the scents. The low snore of an uncle, the quiet hum of a lullaby, the crackle of embers, the occasional rustle as someone turns. Each sound is accompanied by a whiff of air, a puff of breath, a tiny contribution to the night's atmosphere. You feel it on your skin, the warm dampness of shared exhalation clinging like a blanket of its own. Imagine, too, the moment at dawn when the door opens and fresh air finally cuts through. The sharpness of frost rushes in, crisp and clean, shocking after hours of heavy musk. For a moment, the whole family inhales together, grateful for the sting in their lungs. But soon the door is shut, the room grows thick again, and the cycle of smell and survival begins anew. So you settle back under the covers in your mind, breathing through the stench, letting it fade into background. The cold is the greater enemy, And if smell is the price of warmth, it's a price worth paying. You drift towards sleep with the scent of smoke in your nose and the rhythm of shared breath in your ears, cocooned not only in blankets, but in the pungent reality of medieval survival. The heavy air, thick with breath and smoke, settles around you like another blanket, and yet you still shiver. No matter how many bodies huddle together, no matter how many pelts weigh down the straw, there are always little gaps, the exposed face, the bare toes that sting with cold. And so medieval families turned to smaller protections, garments, and accessories made specifically for the night. The most humble, and perhaps most essential, were head coverings and socks. Descriptions in inventories and paintings remind us that the medieval nightcap was not a whimsical accessory, but a practical necessity. These caps were usually simple cones of wool or linen, tied under the chin or left loose, covering ears and scalp. Why the head? Because heat escapes quickly there, and in a world where noses frosted in sleep, a warm head could mean the difference between rest and shivering. Imagine slipping a woolen cap over your hair, pulling it low to your eyebrows, feeling the itch but also the warmth as it seals in your body's fragile heat. A quirky little detail from some household manuals. People sometimes wrapped scarves or strips of cloth around their chins, leaving only a small hole for breathing. These improvised mufflers kept frost from forming on lips and facial hair. Picture a man lying stiffly in bed, his beard trapped beneath layers of cloth, his breath dampening the fabric, creating tiny crystals by morning. Inconvenient, yes, but better than waking with cracked skin. Scholars remain divided over how common socks and stockings were at night. Some argue that peasants slept in the same hose they wore all day, never removing them until they disintegrated. Others suggest that families crafted special sleeping hose, thick wool pieces dedicated to nighttime wear. Archaeological finds of worn stockings, repaired again and again, hint that both practices coexisted. What is certain is that warm feet mattered, chilblains and frostbite were constant risks in winter. Close your eyes and feel it. The scratch of rough wool against your ankles, the constriction of cloth tied at the knee. It isn't comfortable, wool itches, seams rub, but when you tuck your feet beneath a sibling or press them against a dog, the added layer makes all the difference. Even nobles, cushioned in featherbeds, wore socks to bed, often lined with fur or embroidered for display. Warmth and vanity could share the same garment. The sensory world expands. The cap itches slightly, leaving your scalp hot and your forehead damp. The stockings pinch at the knees, where the ties bite into skin. Yet each time a draft sneaks under the covers, you thank the fabric. Without it, the chill would slice deeper, sharper. You shift slightly, tugging the cap lower, curling your toes inside the hose. Your body may ache, but at least it does not freeze. A curious anecdote survives from a noblewoman's correspondence. She complained that her husband snored so loudly he blew the bed hangings, and she resorted to wrapping not only her head, but her ears to block the noise. In her case, the nightcap doubled as earplugs, muffling sound as well as retaining warmth. You can picture her, face wrapped tight, cocooned in cloth, both amused and exasperated by her nightly battle. The psychology of these garments is worth noting. Clothing became armor against the night, a reminder that survival depended on preparation. Just as a soldier would not enter battle unarmed, a medieval family would not enter sleep without caps, hose, and scarves. To sleep uncovered was recklessness. Parents scolded children for pulling off caps in the night, warning them they would lose their warmth to the spirits. It was less superstition than practical wisdom. Consider the noises of such preparation. The shuffle of fabric as caps are tied, the snap of stockings being pulled into place, the soft laugh of a child resisting the itchy wool. In the fire's glow, a family looks more like they're dressing for travel than for bed. Then the covers are pulled tight, the drafts muffled, and the room grows still, broken only by breathing and the faint creak of wood settling in the cold. Even in monasteries where simplicity ruled, monks wore hoods to bed, their habits doubling as nightclothes. Rows of tonsured heads disappeared beneath fabric, each man wrapped like a chrysalis, identical in discipline, united in endurance. The sound of their collective breathing was like wind through reeds, hushed and rhythmic, as they slept in regimented warmth. Another oddity: some peasants padded their stockings with straw or moss for extra insulation. Imagine lying in bed, your feet bulky, rustling slightly each time you move. The smell of earth and grass rises faintly with every shift. It's primitive, but it works. And in survival, effectiveness always outranks elegance. Now picture yourself, fully dressed, head wrapped, feet encased, body layered in tunics and cloaks. You are heavy, stiff, awkward, but you are warm. The cap presses against your ears, muffling the howl of wind. Your feet tingle with heat trapped inside wool. The world outside may be frozen, but inside your cocoon of fabric, you hold a pocket of life. And that is all you need to drift, slowly, uneasily, but safely, into sleep. The woolen cap slips lower over your ears as you dream, muffling the sound of wind. But then another noise intrudes, the coughing of someone across the room. You open your eyes and realize the air itself feels different, heavier, harsher. The fire that promised comfort has filled the chamber not only with warmth but with smoke. For many medieval families, the same blaze that protected them from frost also poisoned their lungs. Manorial records and medical texts mention how peat, coal, or green wood were burned when seasoned firewood ran short. These fuels produced dense smoke that clung low in the room, seeping into hair, clothes, and bedding. Imagine lying in a cottage with no chimney, just a hole in the roof for the smoke to escape. The air inside is thick, acrid. Your eyes water, and every breath carries a rasp. You cough softly, but everyone coughs, so no one complains. Survival is never clean. One peculiar habit noted by travelers in northern Europe was the use of smouldering peat blocks placed beneath raised beds. They gave off steady heat, but also released a pungent odor, filling the room with the smell of earth and sulfur. You picture lying above such a block, the warmth seeping up through the straw, while your nostrils sting from the fumes. Comfort and discomfort arrive hand in hand, inseparable companions. Specialists still dispute how dangerous these smoky conditions truly were. Some argue that constant exposure led to chronic respiratory problems, evidenced by skeletal remains showing damaged sinuses. Others suggest people adapted to the air, their bodies hardened by years of inhaling smoke. The debate continues, but the coughing in records, the complaints of watery eyes, and the advice of physicians all suggest the air was far from harmless. The sensory world is overwhelming. The smoke burns your throat, leaving it raw. It coats the roof beams, blackening them until soot rains down each time the wind rattles the house. Your blanket smells permanently of ash, no matter how many times it is aired. And yet the heat it brings means you can still stretch your toes, still feel warmth against your skin, still hope to wake in the morning. For nobles in stone castles, the problem was only partly better. Great fireplaces drew smoke upward, but drafts often forced it back down. Servants fanned the air, tapestries helped absorb the haze, yet the smell of charred wood lingered in every hall. Guests sometimes left with their clothes reeking so strongly of smoke that the scent followed them for days. Imagine a feast ending late at night, lords retreating to their chambers, and all of them coughing softly as they pulled furs over their heads. A curious remedy appears in medieval medical texts, burning herbs like juniper or rosemary to sweeten the air. The smoke was still smoke, but it carried a different perfume, believed to counter illness. You picture a mother tossing sprigs of rosemary onto the fire before bed, the fragrant crackle filling the room, children murmuring about the nicer smell. Whether it truly helped or not, it must have felt like a gift. The psychological toll of smoky nights is worth imagining. Families knew the fire that gave life could also choke them. Parents worried about infants smothering under heavy covers or coughing themselves weak. Adults woke with headaches, eyes red and sore, yet no one suggested sleeping without fire. The risk of freezing outweighed the risk of coughing. It was a gamble made every night, with no better option. Think of the sounds. The crackle of peat, sharper and lower than wood. The faint hiss of damp logs steaming in the hearth. The rasp of a child's cough, followed by the soft pat of a mother's hand on his back. Outside, the wind claws at the shutters, but inside, the more pressing battle is against the invisible weight of smoke. In monasteries, the rule of endurance meant monks often went without fires entirely in their dormitories. But in infirmaries or guest houses, the hearths blazed, and with them came the haze. Pilgrims and the sick lay wrapped in blankets, soot collecting on their faces as they drifted into uneasy sleep. The irony was sharp. The fire meant to heal could also harm. Another odd detail emerges from travel accounts. Some families deliberately kept smoke thick in their cottages, believing it preserved wooden beams from rot and killed pests in the thatch. A smoky house was not seen as a flaw but as maintenance. You picture a family lying beneath rafters black with soot, reassuring themselves that the sting in their lungs was protecting the house above their heads. Now, in your imagination, you curl back under the blanket. Your eyes sting, your throat itches, and yet your feet are warm. The fire hisses low, casting shadows that dance across the sooty ceiling. You take a slow breath, coughing once, then settle against the straw. The smell of smoke is inescapable, but it is also the smell of survival. And so you close your eyes, telling yourself as countless others did that warmth, even smoky warmth, is better than no warmth at all. The haze of peat smoke still lingers in your imagination, acrid and clinging, when you remember something else. Not every medieval person trusted warmth to mere fire, fur, or bodies. Some believed invisible forces governed the night, and so they turned to charms, amulets, and whispered words to protect them from both frost and spirits. For in a world where cold itself could kill, the unseen felt just as threatening as the icy air. Medieval sermons and folk records remind us that people often pinned charms to their clothing or tucked them into bedding. A simple cross carved from wood might rest beneath a pillow. A pouch of herbs, sage, rue, or vervain could be tied to a child's nightshirt, meant to ward off chills and demons alike. You imagine lying down with such a pouch pressed against your chest, its faint herbal smell mixing with wool and smoke, your mind calmer because you believe you are guarded on two fronts. One peculiar custom appears in rural folklore. Children were sometimes given pieces of iron, such as nails or tiny knives, to keep under their pillows. The iron was thought to repel malevolent spirits that prowled in the night. Picture a mother whispering to her son, "Keep this by you, and nothing cold or evil can touch you," as she slides the object under his straw pillow. It seems harsh to give a child a weapon, but in that world, it was reassurance. Specialists still argue about how much these practices were religious and how much they were cultural habit. Some historians maintain that belief in charms was rooted in pagan traditions lingering beneath Christian layers. Others suggest that even devout Christians embraced amulets without contradiction, seeing them as physical prayers rather than superstition. The line between faith and folklore was thin, blurred by necessity and fear of the winter night. The sensory world of these charms is vivid. Imagine a bed that smells not only of straw and smoke but also of dried herbs, sharp and bitter. A string of beads presses against your chest as you roll over. The faint metallic tang of iron lies beneath your pillow. These are not comforts in the modern sense. They itch, they poke, they smell, but they soothe the imagination. And the imagination is half the battle against fear. In noble households, charms took more ornate forms. A jeweled reliquary might be hung above the bed, containing a fragment of a saint's bone. Pilgrimage badges were sewn into bed curtains, tokens believed to carry protective power. You can almost see the flicker of candlelight reflecting off a tiny silver cross pinned to a child's blanket, the mother sighing with relief as she pulls the covers close, certain that both warmth and holiness guard the child. There is an odd anecdote from a parish chronicle in France. One family swore by hanging a horseshoe over their bed each winter, claiming it kept both frost and witches away. Villagers laughed, yet no one mocked too loudly after all. The family seemed to endure winters better than most. Superstition and survival often walked hand in hand. The psychological comfort of such objects cannot be overstated. In a draughty hall lying under smoky rafters, the fear of unseen spirit was as real as the fear of freezing. A child clutching an amulet felt safer, and that sense of safety allowed sleep to come. Parents, too, rested easier knowing they had done anything to push back against the dangers of the night. Whether or not charms actually changed the temperature, they warmed the spirit. Listen to the sounds of this world. A mother whispers a prayer as she tucks her child in, her voice low, rhythmic. A pouch of herbs rustles softly as it shifts under the blanket. The faint clink of a metal charm sounds as someone rolls over. Outside, the wind groans, a sound villagers often imagined as spirits prowling the dark. Inside, the charms answer with silence, their presence enough to calm frightened minds. Monasteries, of course, discourage such practices, insisting that prayer alone should suffice. Yet even monks wrote prayers against the cold, invoking saints to keep frost from creeping into dormitories. One manuscript includes a blessing specifically for bedding, calling on divine warmth to protect the sleeper. Even in cloisters, the need for reassurance in the night was undeniable. The symbolism is powerful. To sleep under a charm is to admit vulnerability, to say that furs and fires are not enough, that you need invisible help. But it is also to acknowledge community, tradition, and shared belief. Each amulet carried the weight of generations, a reminder that survival was not just physical but spiritual. Now imagine yourself back in the straw bed, pulling a blanket of rough wool over your shoulders. A pouch of herbs presses against your chest. A wooden cross lies beneath your pillow. Outside, the frost spreads silently, unstoppable, indifferent. Yet you breathe easier, because you believe you are guarded. The cold still seeps into your toes, the smoke still stings your eyes, but fear loosens its grip. You drift into dreams where warmth is not only physical but also blessed, where even the frost cannot reach the place your mind calls safe. The amulet under your pillow presses lightly against your cheek, but before long you're reminded that the most treasured warmth came not from charms or smoke but from water, heated, soothing, rare as treasure in winter. Bathing before bed was a luxury in the medieval world, and when it happened, it felt almost miraculous. Imagine stepping into a tub filled with steaming water after days of shivering. Your body loosens, your skin tingles, and for one glorious moment the frost loses all power. Medical writings and chronicles show that warm baths were recommended for health, particularly to ease aching joints and lull the body into rest. But fuel to heat water was costly, and tubs were awkward to fill. For peasants, the chance to bathe in winter might come only a handful of times, often when illness struck or childbirth required it. You can picture a mother boiling kettle after kettle over the hearth, pouring them into a wooden tub set near the fire. Children crowd close, eyes wide with longing, knowing they may not taste such luxury for months. One curious custom noted in town records was the sharing of bath water. Families took turns in the same tub, from eldest to youngest, each person climbing into water that grew cloudier with each use. It sounds unappealing to us, but to them, the warmth itself mattered more than cleanliness. Imagine sinking into water already cooled and murky, still grateful because it means not sleeping with frozen muscles. Researchers continue to debate how frequently medieval people actually bathed. Some argue that hygiene practices were more regular than stereotypes suggest, pointing to the popularity of bathhouses in towns. Others emphasize how fuel shortages and moral suspicion made bathing rare, especially in colder months. Whatever the truth, heated water before bed was exceptional enough to be remembered with joy in letters and poems. The sensory imagery is vivid. The tub creaks as you lower yourself in, the wood swollen with heat. Steam rises, mingling with smoke from the hearth, filling the room with a damp haze. Your skin prickles as icy air collides with scalding water. You close your eyes, the scent of herbs drifting up if the bath has been infused with rosemary or thyme. The contrast between freezing air and heated water is almost overwhelming, painful at first, then blissful. In noble households, bathing could be elevated into spectacle. Tubs were lined with cloth, filled with wine or milk, and perfumed with imported oils. Servants poured hot water steadily to keep the temperature constant. A lord might recline with a goblet of mulled wine, steam rising around him, laughter echoing in the chamber. Imagine the glow of torchlight on the water's surface, the shimmer of perfumed oil, the decadence of warmth treated as leisure instead of survival. Yet even for nobles, the warmth ended quickly. After the bath, water clung to skin, cooling fast in the draughty chamber. Without swift drying and thick furs, the body could chill more dangerously than before. Physicians warned that baths opened the pores, making sleepers vulnerable to the night air. Picture a child whisked from the tub, rubbed dry with linen until the skin turned pink, then bundled in wool and hurried under covers before the heat fled. Another curious note: bathhouses in towns often doubled as social centers. Travelers arriving late could warm themselves in communal tubs, then step directly into nearby inns to sleep. The warmth of the bath lingered as they curled on straw, an afterglow against the bitter night. For peasants who never afforded such luxury, these stories must have sounded like tales of paradise. The psychological effect of bathing before bed cannot be understated. To go to sleep feeling clean, warm, and soothed was rare enough to feel almost holy. Chroniclers describe monks being allowed occasional warm baths as acts of mercy, especially for the sick. The contrast between daily cold and fleeting warmth left deep impressions. You can almost feel it in your bones, the sense of floating, of sinking, of being briefly safe from the relentless grasp of frost. The sounds of such a ritual fill the imagination. Buckets slosh as water is carried from hearth to tub. Children squeal as they dip toes, yanking them back from heat. The fire roars, kettles whistle, steam hisses when poured too quickly. Then silence, broken only by the sigh of someone finally lowering into comfort. The night beyond howls with winter, but inside, the tub becomes a tiny pocket of summer. You climb out of the water in your mind now, skin damp, hair dripping, body loose. A servant or sibling hands you a rough linen cloth, the fibers coarse against tender skin. You pull on woolen stockings, tug a cap over wet hair, and slip beneath furs. The heat of the bath lingers just long enough to carry you into dreams. Tomorrow you will stink of smoke and sweat again, but tonight you sleep in the rare memory of warmth. The afterglow of the warm bath fades as dawn creeps into your thoughts, and you realize that sleep itself followed different rhythms depending on the season. Medieval nights were not governed by the steady electric hours we know today, but by the changing balance of light and dark. In winter, when days were short and nights impossibly long, families naturally stretched their rest, sleeping in longer intervals, rising for tasks in the dark, then slipping back under covers until morning. Diaries, sermons, and medical treatises all mention the concept of first sleep and second sleep, especially during the colder months. After dusk, families retired early, worn out from labor and eager to escape the cold. They slept a few hours, then woke around midnight to tend fires, use chamber pots, or even pray. After this interlude, sometimes lasting an hour or more, they returned to bed for a second stretch until dawn. Imagine waking in the pitch dark, fumbling for the fire, whispering a prayer, then crawling back under scratchy blankets for another round of uneasy warmth. One curious domestic custom, noted in parish records, was couples using the midnight interval for conversation, planning, or intimacy. With the day consumed by labor and the evening filled with noise, the silent gap between sleeps became private time. You can almost hear the low murmur of voices under blankets, a couple whispering about livestock, debts, or gossip, their words softened by the shared cocoon. Children, meanwhile, sometimes listened drowsily, half aware, before drifting back into their second slumber. Researchers continue to discuss how widespread this segmented sleep truly was. Some argue that it was nearly universal, shaped by natural circadian rhythms and the absence of artificial light. Others caution that evidence is patchy and may represent specific regions or classes. Yet the pattern is mentioned often enough to suggest it was familiar to many. Winter, with its long nights, made the division feel inevitable. The sensory imagery of such rhythms is sharp. You picture yourself waking in the cold silence, the air biting at your nose, the room hushed except for snores. The fire has burned low, embers glowing faintly under ash. You rise, breath misting, and shuffle to the hearth, stirring the coals. The sound is soft, the smell of smoke sharp, the brief flare of flame momentarily illuminating the dark. Then, with chores complete, you crawl back into bed, the wool stiff with frost, and sink into second sleep. In monasteries, the rhythm was formalized. Monks rose for the night office, matins summoned by bells that echoed through cloisters. They chanted in the cold chapel, breath rising in misty clouds, then returned to pallets for a shorter second rest. Imagine the shuffle of sandaled feet across frozen stone, the drone of voices filling a dark hall, the faint comfort of rejoining fellow monks under rough blankets afterward. Sleep was measured, disciplined, shaped by devotion as much as by survival. In noble households, the rhythm was more flexible but still present. A lord might wake in the night to confer with servants, to plan hunts or patrols, or to sip warm wine. Guests were sometimes entertained even after midnight, the long winter hours too heavy to waste entirely on unconsciousness. Curtains were drawn back, candles lit, and quiet conversations carried into the small hours before beds were remade and second sleep resumed. Another peculiar note comes from folk remedies. Some physicians recommended using the interval between sleeps for reflection and prayer, claiming that the mind was clearest then. A person might rise to recite psalms or meditate on dreams, believing the midnight hour carried special wisdom. You can picture an old man sitting by the embers, mumbling prayers, interpreting the images he had just seen, before crawling stiffly back into straw. The psychological comfort of segmented sleep was subtle. Instead of fearing the endless dark, people broke it into manageable pieces. Waking in the night was not frightening, it was expected. The cold was still sharp, but the knowledge that warmth waited under blankets made the interruption bearable. Families grew used to this ebb and flow, their lives syncing with nature's rhythms. Imagine the sounds of such nights. A child whimpers softly, soothed by a parent's hand. The fire cracks as it is stirred. A whispered prayer drifts across the room. Then the blanket rustles, the bodies shift, and silence resumes. Outside, wolves may prowl, or the wind may shriek, but inside, the household returns to its cocoon, ready to surrender once more to dreams. And so you lie there, half awake, half asleep, breathing in smoky air, your body adjusting to the rhythm of the night. You know this will happen again tomorrow, and the next day, until the days lengthen and nights shorten. For medieval families, sleep was not a single journey but a series of crossings, ferrying them back and forth across the dark until the sun finally rose. The rhythm of broken nights drifts away in your imagination, and suddenly you hear voices, many voices. The room is not a family cottage now, but a bustling inn, its common hall crowded with travellers packed tight for warmth. If the shared bed of a family felt intimate, the communal lodging of strangers felt unpredictable, noisy, and sometimes dangerous. Yet for people who braved the winter roads, this was survival. Travel diaries from the late Middle Ages describe inns and hostels where beds were scarce, and space on the floor was sold like treasure. A traveller might pay for a pallet, but just as often he paid simply for room to spread straw. Imagine walking into such a hall at dusk, shaking frost from your cloak, and being directed to squeeze between a farmer and a merchant, both already snoring. The fire blazes in the hearth, but the further from it you lie, the colder the floor grows. One curious practice in busy inns was hot bedding. Guests slept in shifts, two or more using the same bed across different hours. When one rose before dawn, another slid into the still warm hollow. To us, unsettling. To them, pragmatic. You can picture a weary traveller sighing with relief as he stretches into sheets still holding the ghost of someone else's body heat. Scholars remain divided about how much privacy was possible in these places. Some argue that wealthier travellers often paid for small chambers, while others insist that even lords sometimes shared lodgings with strangers when space ran short. Both are true in different contexts, but all agree that the majority of medieval people on the road had little choice. Warmth was communal or not at all. The sensory imagery of these inns is vivid. The air is thick with sweat, smoke, and ale. Wooden mugs clatter as last cups are drained before sleep. Straw rustles as dozens of bodies shift on the floor. Dogs bark faintly outside, muffled by laughter and snoring within. Your blanket is thin, borrowed from the host, smelling faintly of mildew. You clutch it tight anyway, grateful for the fire's fading glow and the warmth of bodies pressed all around you. In monasteries, the hospitality tradition meant travelers often stayed in dormitories maintained by monks. These hostels were slightly cleaner, but no less crowded. Pilgrims to shrines slept side by side, their prayers whispered into the dark, their packs clutched close against theft. You can almost hear the creak of leather satchels beneath heads, the murmur of Latin hymns blending with snores, the shuffle of sandaled feet as a monk tends the fire. One odd anecdote survives from a German traveller. He complained of sharing a bed with a man who muttered curses in his sleep, frightening him into staying awake most of the night. Such stories highlight the unpredictability of communal lodging. The warmth was real, but so were the risks: lice, theft, quarrels, even the shame of unwelcome intimacy. Sleep was never entirely safe among strangers. The psychological side of this world is striking. To surrender your body to slumber beside people you do not know is to accept vulnerability. Yet travelers did it again and again, because the alternative was far worse: freezing outside in barns, under hedgerows, or in church porches. Even with snoring, smells, and danger, the crowded inn hall carried the comfort of humanity gathered together against the cold. Imagine the sounds layered into this night. A drunkard snores so loudly the rafters tremble. Someone mumbles a prayer in French. Another coughs harshly, the echo bouncing across the hall. The fire pops, sending sparks skyward, briefly illuminating weary faces before fading. The room smells of stale beer, damp wool, and bodies unwashed after days of travel. Yet, despite the discomfort, there is warmth enough to let your body ease, enough to survive. Hierarchy even here played its role. The wealthy were given spots nearest the hearth, while the poor huddled at the draughty edges. A merchant sleeps with his boots off, toes wriggling before the fire. A beggar curls in a corner, clutching his blanket to his chest, shivering with every gust that slips under the door. The contrast is stark, but both will wake alive, and that is victory enough. Another peculiar note: some inns kept livestock in the same hall, their body heat contributing to the warmth. Imagine drifting off with a cow shifting beside you, its breath steaming in the dark, or a hen fluttering onto the straw near your head. In such chaos, categories blurred. Travellers, animals, merchants, peasants, all part of the same shared struggle against the night. And so you settle in now, in your mind's eye, among the murmuring crowd. Your blanket is thin, the straw pricks at your skin, but a man snores to your left and a woman sighs to your right, and together their warmth surrounds you. It is not comfort in the modern sense, but it is enough. Outside, the frost waits patiently on the road, but inside this crowded hall, you breathe with dozens of others, safe for one more night. The crowded inn fades from your mind, and you are carried instead into a quieter space, a monastery dormitory. Here, survival of the coldest nights was not just about warmth, but about discipline. The lives of monks revolved around prayer, routine, and denial of comfort, yet even they had to contend with the same bitter winters. What's striking is how their approach to sleep reflected not only necessity but also spiritual ideals. Rules preserved in monastic orders tell us that monks often slept in long halls lined with simple pallets or straw-filled sacks. Each man lay fully clothed, often in the very habits he wore during the day. Shoes were removed, but woolen hoods stayed on, covering shaved heads that otherwise bled heat into the frigid night. Imagine a vast hall lit by a single lamp, dozens of figures lying in neat rows, their breaths rising in white plumes, the silence broken only by coughs and the rustle of cloth. A curious instruction appears in the Rule of St. Benedict. Monks were expected to sleep with belts and knives at their sides, ready to rise at a moment's notice for prayer. It meant that even in the dead of night, their bodies were prepared, clothed, armed, and disciplined. Picture a row of men waking at the bell, rising stiffly from pallets, blades at their belts, shuffling silently into the chapel while frost crackles on the windows. Researchers remain divided about just how harsh monastic dormitories were. Some argue that fires were rarely allowed, the monks expected to embrace cold as a form of penance. Others suggest infirmaries and guest dorms did maintain hearths, offering at least minimal relief. The truth likely varied by wealth and geography, but the principle of endurance remained constant. Monks were taught to accept cold as they accepted hunger or silence, a daily trial of body and spirit. The sensory atmosphere is stark. The stone walls radiate chill, sucking heat from the pallets. The rushes beneath you crunch faintly, their smell earthy but sharp. Your nose is numb, your fingers stiff, yet you pull your hood tighter, murmuring a prayer against the night. The dormitory echoes faintly as another monk shifts, his straw mattress creaking. You are not alone in discomfort. It is shared, sanctified by discipline. One peculiar practice recorded in some houses was the use of communal blankets. Several monks lay under the same broad covering, not unlike peasant families huddling together. Yet here the act was stripped of intimacy. It was about brotherhood and survival, not familial closeness. Imagine lying shoulder to shoulder with fellow brothers, the weight of a rough woolen cover pressing you into place, your bodies creating a collective pocket of heat. The psychology of this arrangement is fascinating. Where peasants saw warmth as necessity and nobles treated it as luxury, monks transformed it into a spiritual trial. To endure the cold patiently was to imitate Christ's suffering. A novice trembling in his sleep was not pitied so much as encouraged to embrace hardship as a test of faith. Still, whispered accounts show that monks grumbled quietly, their complaints masked as coughs or muttered prayers. Think of the sounds that filled such nights. The distant toll of the bell, summoning for matins, the synchronized shuffle of sandaled feet across stone, the low hum of psalms echoing in the chapel, voices weaving together, rising into the rafters like breath turned into music. Then silence again, broken by the rustle of hoods as the monks returned to their pallets, settling back into second sleep. The cold remained, but it was no longer the enemy. It was part of the ritual. In some monasteries, braziers or heated stones were permitted in the infirmary for the sick. Imagine a monk, fevered and weak, lying in a bed near glowing coals, envied by his brethren for the rare warmth. The smell of burning charcoal hangs in the air, acrid but comforting, while the rest of the dormitory lies in icy discipline. Warmth was medicine, not luxury. Another unusual note: monasteries often kept cats to control mice in the dormitories. A monk might wake to feel soft fur brushing his blanket, a small body curling near his feet. The presence of an animal was practical. but it must also have carried a quiet comfort, silent companionship in a night otherwise ruled by austerity. The symbolism of monastic sleep is powerful. To lie in the cold with others was to declare unity, humility, and endurance. Each shiver was a prayer, each breath a reminder of shared faith. The frost outside was relentless, but within the walls of the monastery, it became another chapter in the long discipline of devotion. Now imagine yourself lying in such a dormitory. The hood of your habit scratches against your chin, your straw pallet rustles beneath you, the smell of smoke and bodies lingers faintly. You hear the bell in the distance, the call to prayer, and you rise stiffly, joining the slow procession into the chapel. The cold is deep, the night endless, but you endure not alone but as part of a greater rhythm, where survival and faith intertwine. The cloistered dormitory fades, and you picture yourself instead in a peasant's cottage again. But this time you notice the hearth is strangely empty. Not everyone could afford firewood through the length of winter. When supplies dwindled, families turned to creative ways of generating and conserving warmth, methods that had little to do with roaring flames and much to do with human resourcefulness. Household accounts and folk sayings hint at these struggles. In regions where wood was scarce or jealously guarded by lords, peasants relied on dried turf, peat, or even animal dung pressed into cakes. These fuels burned slowly, giving off steady heat but little flame. Imagine the smell, sharp, earthy, pungent, filling the small room as a cake of dung smoulders in the hearth. It's not pleasant, but the warmth it gives is enough to keep frost from overtaking the bed. One unusual trick, recorded in rural traditions, was the practice of burying pots of hot ashes beneath the bed. The heat radiated upward, turning the straw mattress into a primitive warming pad. You can almost feel it now, the faint warmth seeping from below, comforting but tinged with the acrid scent of ash. Not too much, or the straw might smoulder. It was a careful balance, and families who mastered it gained a crucial edge against the cold. Researchers continue to debate how common these improvised fuels and heating methods were. Some argue they were widespread in Northern Europe, where wood scarcity forced innovation. Others suggest they were regional, tied to the availability of peat bogs or livestock. Archaeological traces, hearths filled with turf ash, midden heaps of dung cakes give evidence but not certainty. What is clear is that survival demanded flexibility, and families used whatever they had. The sensory landscape of these nights is unmistakable. The air is heavy with the smell of smouldering peat, smoky and sulphurous. Ash drifts across the floor, settling in hair and blankets. Your eyes water, your throat stings, but the room is warmer than it would be otherwise. You curl tighter into your bedding, willing yourself to ignore the discomfort. Survival is rarely fragrant. In noble houses, alternative heating took a more refined form. Braziers filled with charcoal glowed in corners, their red light flickering against tapestries. Servants carried these portable fires from room to room, careful to balance heat with ventilation. Imagine the metallic scent of iron, the hiss of charcoal, the dull glow casting eerie shadows on stone walls. Even in wealth, the cold demanded compromise. Warmth came with smoke, and too much could suffocate. A curious anecdote survives from a German chronicle. One household heated bricks in the oven during the day, then wrapped them in cloth and stacked them under blankets at night. Children huddled around these glowing bed bricks, fighting for the warmest spot. You can see it vividly, the scramble of small hands, the squeals as someone grabs a brick too soon, the laughter once they are finally tucked into bed. Simple, effective, and almost joyful. The psychology of these makeshift methods is striking. Warmth became not just physical comfort, but a measure of ingenuity. Families who managed to stretch their fuel or invent creative tricks felt pride, even in hardship. Parents reassured children by pointing to the glowing hearth or the warm stone beneath the covers, proof that they had conquered the night once again. Listen to the sounds of such a household. The low hiss of peat smouldering in the hearth, the scrape of a pot being buried beneath straw, the rustle of blankets as children shift toward hidden warmth, the cough of someone inhaling smoke, followed by the comforting murmur of reassurance. These noises, ordinary and imperfect, stitch together the fragile security of winter sleep. Even monasteries, with their strict rules, sometimes bent to necessity. In especially brutal winters, monks allowed small braziers in dormitories, though only for the sick or elderly. The sight of glowing coals in a sea of shadows must have seemed almost miraculous, a reminder that mercy sometimes outweighed discipline. The faint warmth spreading through a cold hall would have felt like a blessing whispered by fire itself. Another peculiar note: some communities built sleeping platforms above animal stalls, letting the heat of livestock rise into the human quarters. This living furnace made barns warmer than many cottages. Imagine lying on a wooden loft, the sound of cows shifting below, the air thick with their smell but warmed by their bodies. Crude, yes, but in the middle of winter, astonishingly effective. Now, in your imagination, you crawl back into such a bed. The mattress is lumpy, the air smoky, the smell of dung faint but constant. A warm brick rests at your feet, radiating the last of its glow. Beneath the floor, animals stir, their body heat seeping upward. It is not comfort as we know it, but it is warmth. You close your eyes, coughing once against the smoke, then surrender to sleep. Survival does not demand perfection, it demands enough. The smoky warmth of peat and dung fades from your mind, and now you're carried into the chambers of the wealthy, where survival looked different but was no less precarious. Nobles could afford heavy furs, feather beds and braziers, yet even they shivered through stone corridors and draughty towers. Their solution was not only physical comfort but ritual, a nightly performance of bedding arrangements and sleeping ceremonies that blended luxury with necessity. Inventories from noble estates list beds as some of the most valuable possessions, carved from oak or walnut, draped in layers of hangings and cloth. The bed was not just a place to rest, but a symbol of status. Picture a towering four-poster, curtains embroidered with hunting scenes, its frame gleaming in firelight. Servants bustle around it, carrying linens, shaking out quilts, layering furs. To lie in such a bed was to make a statement. Wealth could at least soften, if not banish, the cold. One peculiar custom survives in household manuals. Beds were sometimes aired by warming irons or even pans filled with hot coals run quickly over the sheets. The linens hissed faintly if touched too long, leaving scorch marks as proof of the fire's kiss. You imagine slipping between such sheets, the warmth fading within minutes but the memory of heat enough to lull the body towards sleep. Historians remain divided over how effective these arrangements truly were. Some suggest the thick hangings, layered quilts, feather mattresses created genuine comfort, almost modern by comparison. Others argue that the scale of castles, stone walls, vast ceilings, icy draughts undermined even the best beds, leaving nobles little warmer than peasants. Both views carry truth, and the reality likely shifted with climate and fortune. The sensory details are striking. You lie back against a feather mattress, softer than straw, but notice the damp chill of the stone floor seeping upwards still. The furs piled across your body weigh heavy, pressing you down. The curtains enclose you in shadow, muffling the crackle of the distant hearth. The smell is a blend of perfumed sachets, smoke from braziers, and the faint musk of wool. Luxury masks discomfort, but never erases it. A curious anecdote comes from the court of Burgundy. Nobles sometimes hosted guests in their own beds, not from intimacy but as a show of favour and status. To be allowed to sleep in a duke's bed, beneath his own hangings, was an honour. Imagine sliding under quilts that reek faintly of another's perfume, warmed by braziers placed just for you, knowing that the privilege is more symbolic than comfortable. The psychology of noble sleep is fascinating. Beds were both fortresses and stages. To draw the curtains was to claim privacy in a household teeming with servants. To pile on furs was to demonstrate abundance. Yet the cold remained, creeping through arrow slits and under doors. Even kings complained of icy noses in the night, their crowns powerless against frost. Comfort was relative, not absolute. Listen to the sounds in such a chamber. The creak of carved wood as you settle into the mattress, the shuffle of servants withdrawing, their footsteps soft on rushes, the faint hiss of charcoal in a brazier, the occasional pop as a coal cracks. Beyond the curtains, the draught moans softly, but within your fabric cave, silence reigns. You breathe deeply, inhaling the faint perfume of herbs tucked into pillows to ward off pests, mixed with the heavy musk of fur. Another odd detail. Noble children were sometimes swaddled in silks and tucked into small cradles beside the great beds, close enough to share warmth but far enough to preserve their parents' privacy. Their cries pierced the curtains, reminding even lords that winter nights were communal struggles. The household's wealth might provide silks and servants, but it could not quiet the cold that pressed equally on high and low alike. In monasteries, by contrast, the absence of such luxury underscored the difference. A monk might have envied the noble's feather mattress, but reminded himself that humility lay in straw and discipline. Meanwhile, peasants outside imagined the noble bedchamber as paradise, not knowing that noses inside those curtains still dripped with frost. Perception, as much as reality, shaped the experience of sleep. Now imagine yourself lying in that noble bed. The mattress is soft, the furs heavy, the curtains enclosing. You tug a silk-lined quilt higher, feel its smoothness against your chin. A brazier glows faintly in the corner, casting red light on the stone. Yet your toes still ache, your breath still mists in the dark, and you know the fire will fade before dawn. Wealth has bought you layers, not escape. You close your eyes, surrendering to the illusion of comfort, telling yourself that illusion is enough to carry you into sleep. The noble bedchamber fades, and you find yourself once again in the thick of village life, where survival was measured not by carved oak posts or embroidered curtains, but by sheer resourcefulness. In these cottages, every scrap of warmth had to be earned, every layer patched, and every tool repurposed. Sleep was not just something that happened, it was prepared for like a campaign against the cold. Household inventories from peasants reveal how precious even the humblest bedding was. A patched wool blanket might be listed alongside livestock in value, a legacy passed down from one generation to the next. Families clung to quilts so threadbare that they were more whole than fabric, sewing them with scraps of sackcloth, layering them with whatever they had. Imagine lying beneath a patchwork of colours and textures, coarse burlap rubbing against wool, bits of linen stitched haphazardly into place. The blanket may be ugly, but its weight presses down like a shield against the night. One unusual practice noted in rural folklore was the use of straw sacks as top covers. Instead of filling them as mattresses, families sometimes spread them over their bodies. The sacks trapped air, adding insulation, though they were scratchy and heavy. Picture the sensation, lying on straw below, covered by straw above. Your world reduced to rustling and the earthy scent of dry grass. It is not elegant, but you feel cocooned, buried in warmth stolen from last summer's harvest. Scholars still argue how widespread quilts and padded blankets truly were among the poor. Some believe most peasants relied solely on cloaks and straw, while others point to wills that mention humble quilts, proof that even small households valued them. Archaeological textiles unearthed from rural sites suggest that homespun cloth, though coarse, could be layered into effective, if uncomfortable, bedding. The truth likely lies in variety. Each family devised its own arsenal against the frost. The sensory experience of such improvisation is vivid. The patched quilt smells faintly of smoke, the fabric stiff with years of use. The straw sack above you prickles your cheek as you turn, dust rising with every shift. Your ears catch the faint creak of wooden beams overhead, the muffled sighs of sleeping kin, the hiss of the dying fire. You curl tighter, grateful for the weight of anything that traps heat, however awkward. Another quirky habit emerges from some English accounts. Peasants saved the hides of slaughtered animals and laid them across the bed, hair and all. Calf skins, sheepskins, even pig hides became impromptu blankets. You can almost feel the bristly surface against your fingers, smell the lingering musk of animal fat. To us, unsettling. To them, life-saving. For noble households, improvisation had a different character. Servants sometimes doubled quilts by sewing fur into the lining, creating hybrid covers that combined luxury and practicality. The rich might drape a cloak lined with ermine or fox over their beds, not only for display but for warmth. Imagine running your hand over fur so soft it squeaks faintly under your touch, the sensation decadent even as frost clings to the window. The psychology of these makeshift solutions is compelling. To sleep beneath rags or animal hides was to acknowledge poverty, but also ingenuity. Each patch, each layer, each odd combination carried the pride of survival. Parents reassured children with stories. This quilt has seen 10 winters. It will carry you through this one too. The blanket became not only a cover, but a talisman of endurance. Listen to the sounds of such a night. A child whines about the itch of straw against their chin. A mother hushes them, promising warmth if they lie still. The quilt rustles as bodies shift, its seams creaking, a faint rip threatening at the edges. Outside, the wind groans against the shutters, but inside, the patched layers hold, fragile yet sufficient. A peculiar note surfaces from folk songs. Some verses celebrated the act of piling on cloaks and blankets, turning the nightly ritual into a kind of comic boast. 2 cloaks for my shoulders, 3 sacks for my head. One line goes, hinting at the humor people used to soften hardship. You can almost hear laughter in the dark, even as bodies shivered beneath their ridiculous but effective piles of fabric. Now imagine yourself back under such a patchwork. The blanket is lumpy, uneven, heavy in places, thin in others. A straw sack scratches at your cheek, an old hide lies across your knees, and a patched cloak covers your shoulders. The smell is smoky, earthy, faintly rancid, yet you are warmer than you would be without it. And as your breathing slows, you realize that warmth has little to do with beauty or comfort. It is the simple, stubborn refusal to freeze. That refusal, woven into every patch and hide, is what carries you through another winter's night. The patchwork quilt of hides and sacks fades, and now you are carried into a different kind of winter night, one shaped not by improvisation alone, but by ritual. For medieval families, the way they prepared for bed was as important as the bedding itself. Each evening became a ceremony of sorts, tending the fire, arranging the covers, blessing the house, and finally huddling together in a practiced choreography that gave order to long, uncertain nights. Household guides and sermons often mention the evening routine. Parents taught children to wash their hands and faces with cold water before bed, partly for hygiene but also for piety. Imagine standing in a dim room, dipping your fingers into icy water, splashing your cheeks, the chill biting hard but waking you just enough to murmur a prayer before crawling under furs. The water leaves your skin stinging, your breath sharp, but the ritual steadies your mind. One curious practice found in rural records was bed prayers, simple rhymes spoken by children before sleep. Some were charms against frost or illness, cold at the door, warmth at the bed, God keep the frost from my head. You can picture a child whispering these words into the dark, clutching a rough blanket tighter, believing the rhyme itself could hold off the cold. Researchers continue to discuss whether such bedtime rituals were universal or regional. Some argue that nearly every household, from cottages to castles, relied on prayers and blessings before sleep. Others suggest they were more common in religiously strict communities or among children. The evidence is scattered, but the very existence of these verses hints at a deep need for reassurance in a hostile night. The sensory imagery is vivid. You sit by the hearth as your father stirs the embers, sparks leaping like fireflies. The smell of smoke lingers, clinging to your hair. Your mother shakes out the bedding, the straw rustling, the scent of old grass rising in the air. A sibling yawns loudly, rubbing eyes with soot-stained hands. Together, the family whispers prayers, voices overlapping in a low murmur. The fire sighs as ash settles. Then the rush begins. Everyone dives into their allotted places, pulling covers over shoulders, curling into practiced shapes. Another odd detail emerges from noble households. Servants sometimes read aloud or sang psalms as their lords retired. The words were as much for comfort as for devotion, softening the transition into sleep. Imagine lying in a curtained bed while the drone of a psalm echoes, candlelight flickering against embroidered hangings, the rhythm of words lulling you even as frost gnaws at the chamber door. For peasants, the ritual might be simpler but no less meaningful. Some families scattered holy water at the door before sleep, believing it protected the household. Others made the sign of the cross on each child's forehead. These small gestures, part faith, part habit, transformed the act of sleeping into a sacred pause in the fight for survival. The psychology of ritual is clear. Cold nights were frightening, unpredictable, and sometimes deadly. But by following the same steps each evening, families created a sense of control. Washing, praying, layering, huddling, each act reassured them that they had done all they could. Ritual became a shield for the mind, just as blankets were shields for the body. Listen to the sounds of this preparation: the rattle of a poker in the hearth, the shuffle of feet on rushes, the hiss of water poured into a basin, the low murmur of prayers, some sincere, some mumbled half asleep. The rustle of straw as bedding is shaken, the thud of a log added to the fire, the creak of a door barred against the night. Then silence, broken only by the settling of bodies, the chorus of sighs as warmth begins to build. There's a curious anecdote from a French chronicle. One family believed that reciting the names of saints aloud as they lay down ensured that each child would dream of warmth, not cold. The chronicler, half amused, noted that the children did indeed seem to sleep more soundly. Whether placebo or miracle, the effect was real enough for those who lived it. In monasteries, the ritual was more rigid. Bells marked the hour of compline, the final prayers before rest. Monks sang together in the chapel, their voices echoing in stone halls, before filing silently into dormitories. The very act of sleep became part of devotion, bracketed by prayer on both sides. The night was not an interruption of faith, but an extension of it. Now imagine yourself back in a small cottage, the evening ritual complete. The fire is banked, the prayers whispered, the bedding shaken and smoothed. You crawl into place, children pressed against your side, the smell of straw rising around you. The blanket is rough, the draft still tickles at your nose, but the rhythm of ritual has done its work. You feel calmer, steadier, less alone. You close your eyes, repeating softly the rhyme you learned as a child: cold at the door, warmth at the bed. And for a little while, you believe it. The cottage prayer fades from your imagination, and you find yourself instead in the midst of a harsher winter, when no amount of ritual or layering could fully tame the cold. There were nights so brutal that survival required extraordinary measures, and the stories of these nights linger in chronicles and folklore. People remembered not the ordinary shivers, but the extremes when rivers froze solid, when livestock perished, when even the breath inside a house hung in the air like glass. Chroniclers describe the great frosts that struck Europe, winters so severe that wine barrels split, bread turned to stone, and ink froze in monks' quills. Imagine lying in bed under every blanket you own, yet still feeling your teeth chatter, your fingers numb. You can see your breath rising in silver plumes above your face, lingering like smoke. The straw beneath you is brittle with frost where it touches the wall. Sleep comes, but only in fragments, as your body shudders itself awake again and again. One curious anecdote from a 15th century account tells of families sleeping with heated stones wrapped in animal bladders to keep them from cooling too quickly. The bladders crackled faintly, smelling faintly of leather, but they extended the heat by hours. Picture clutching one to your chest, the warmth steady but strange, as though you've captured a living creature to guard you through the night. Researchers continue to debate how widespread true frostbite deaths were among common folk. Some argue that families knew enough tricks, layering, huddling, banking fires to avoid the worst outcomes. Others point to records of frozen travelers, and even peasants found stiff in their beds after brutal storms. The disagreement reflects a reality both terrifying and ordinary. Cold was an enemy everyone knew, but in rare years it became almost unbeatable. The sensory experience of these extreme nights is seared into memory. The air is sharp as knives. Every breath burns in your nostrils. Blankets stiffen with frost where your exhalations freeze on the fabric. Your toes ache, your fingers twitch, your body curls tighter and tighter. The fire pops weakly, unable to conquer the cold that seeps through stone, wood, and even flesh. Sleep is no longer rest. It is a gamble with death. For nobles, the extremes were equally harsh. A chronicler at the court of Burgundy described a winter where ice formed inside castle chambers, frost clinging to tapestries and bed curtains. Servants woke early to hack ice from water jugs, their hands raw and bleeding. Imagine lying beneath silk quilts lined with fur, only to wake with frost sparkling above your bed like stars. Wealth bought layers, but not immunity. One peculiar folk remedy against such nights was to sleep with bread or grain sacks in the bed, the stored food believed to hold warmth. A family might pile sacks of rye or barley over their legs, the weight pressing down, the faint smell of grain filling the air. Practical and symbolic, the food represented life itself, doubling as insulation. You can almost feel the rough cloth against your skin, the kernels shifting inside. Strange, but strangely reassuring. The psychological impact of these brutal winters was profound. Fear of freezing to death in sleep-haunted families. Parents woke repeatedly to check on children, pressing cold hands to small chests to be sure they still breathed. Neighbors told stories of wanderers lost in the snow, bodies found in the thaw, reminders that no one was safe. Yet people endured, and the very telling of these tales became part of their resilience. Listen to the sounds of such a night, the groan of timbers contracting in the cold, the faint crack of ice spreading along walls and windows, the muffled whimper of a child buried deep in blankets, the hiss of a log collapsing into ash. Outside, the world is silent, frozen solid, but inside, every creak and sigh carries the weight of survival. Another odd note: some families intentionally kept livestock inside their cottages during such extremes, not just beneath lofts, but in the very same room. Cows, goats, even pigs crowded in, their breath steaming, their bodies radiating heat. The smell was overwhelming, but the warmth could mean life. Picture yourself wedged between your children on one side and a cow on the other, its hide coarse against your blanket, its breath damp on your neck. Not comfortable, but warmer than solitude. The symbolism of these desperate measures is stark. Cold was a test, a reminder of human fragility. To survive, it required not only strength but adaptation, the willingness to bend pride and endure indignities. To sleep with grain sacks, animal bladders, or livestock was not shame but ingenuity. Each strategy whispered the same truth: warmth is worth any compromise. Now imagine yourself in such a night. The room is silent, your breath a mist above you. A warm stone rests at your feet, wrapped in leather, its heat already fading. Grain sacks press down on your legs, heavy but comforting. A cow shifts beside you, the straw rustling as it exhales. Children breathe softly against your shoulder. It is crowded, smoky, pungent, but it is survival. You close your eyes, repeating silently the hope of all who endured those winters. That dawn will come, that the fire will spark again, that frost will not be the final master. The memory of those brutal winters lingers, but your imagination softens now, carrying you into the quieter aftermath of survival. You've endured the biting nights, the smoky air, the heavy furs, and the crowded beds. You've whispered prayers against frost, clutched warm stones, and huddled beside animals. And as the sky outside begins to pale, you realize the true miracle of medieval sleep wasn't comfort, it was persistence. Families learned not to defeat the cold, but to outlast it, one night at a time. Household accounts and chronicles show that each morning was almost ceremonial. Survivors rose stiff and bleary, brushing frost from bedding, coughing out smoke from their lungs. Mothers checked on infants. Fathers stoked the fire back to life. Children rubbed numb toes until they tingled again. Imagine the sounds: the scrape of poker against ash, the cough of someone clearing their throat, the quiet sigh of relief that everyone made it through. Each dawn was proof that the strategies, however odd or imperfect, had worked. One curious custom noted in rural folklore was the morning airing of bedding. Families dragged straw mattresses or quilts into weak winter sun, shaking them vigorously to scatter dust and insects. The air was sharp, the fabric stiff, but the act symbolized resilience. Picture the sight: woolen blankets flapping in icy wind, neighbors nodding to each other, silently grateful that another night had passed without loss. Historians remain divided on how to judge these routines. Some argue that medieval people were perpetually miserable in winter, their lives dominated by discomfort. Others suggest that endurance built its own kind of normalcy, that families accepted hardship so completely it ceased to feel unusual. The truth likely rests somewhere between. Lives were indeed hard, but the human ability to normalize and adapt gave them the strength to carry on. The sensory memory of those nights clings even as morning comes. The smell of smoke still fills your nose, the musk of wool and straw lingers on your skin, and your hair feels stiff with frost. Your muscles ache from curling tight, your eyes sting from soot, but the sight of weak sunlight pushing through horn-covered windows feels like triumph. You survived, and in surviving, you reclaimed the day. Noble households marked the